The end of a persona and the next step. To say the last few years has been interesting, would be an understatement. Shortly after the forming of the Constitution and IEC, I died. Well, I didn't die, but my persona Adam Godas did. The funeral was nice, with many heads of state showing up for it. But now that all of my plans were finished, I no longer needed to be weighed down with the responsibility of representing a colony, so after the funeral, I went on vacation. The issue was I didn't exactly know what to do. I knew I could no longer stay where I was, because, well, I was technically dead. So I had my belongings from my home packed up and shipped off to Julius in England. So now with nothing else for me here, I had to find something to do. 1865 New York. Thank you all for coming. Godfrey Gunther shouted over the crowd of people that stood in front of him. Mr. Mayor, what do you think of this tremendous day? A newspaper journalist yelled in a vain hope to be heard over the hundreds of others wishing to get that perfect quote to fill their newspapers. Waving at the crowd, pretending he couldn't hear any of them, the mayor gestured to a man that stood off to the side of the large wooden stage. Walking to the middle of the stage, a very well-dressed man by the name of Montgomery Rothschild shook the hand of the mayor. Glad to be here, Montgomery said in his refined English upper-crust accent. The pleasure is all mine. Godfrey said enthusiastically. Please, if you would say a few words to the crowd. Godfrey asked. Of course, Montgomery said, as he turned to look at the hundreds of people that stood in front of him. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, Montgomery shouted, pausing to wait for the roar of the large crowd to quiet. After a few more minutes, the crowd cooled to a slight rumble, allowing Montgomery to continue. I stand before you today as a representative of Gringotts Bank, an esteemed financial institution that has played a pivotal role in the development and progress of this great nation. It is with great honor and pride that I address this distinguished gathering on this momentous occasion, the opening of the Transcontinental Railroad. Montgomery shouted out, sending the crowd into another frenzy of cheers, hoots, and hollers. Today, we gather to celebrate the years of hard work, dedication, and visionary leadership. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad marks a significant milestone in the history of the United States, symbolizing the triumph of human ingenuity and the power of collaboration. Gringotts Bank, as a staunch supporter of progress and economic development, takes immense pride in having played a vital role in the realization of this monumental project. Through our unwavering commitment to the growth and prosperity of this nation, we have provided the necessary financial resources to fund the construction of this extraordinary railroad. The crowd clapped their hands together, filling the air like thunder. Montgomery raised his hands to quiet the crowd again. The Transcontinental Railroad is not merely a feat of engineering, it is a symbol of unity and progress. This remarkable infrastructure connects the east and west coasts of the United States, bridging the vast expanse of land that once separated our nation's people. It is a testament to the indomitable spirit of exploration and the tireless pursuit of a brighter future. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad opens up new horizons for trade, commerce, and cultural exchange. It will foster economic growth, create employment opportunities, and enhance connectivity between communities across this great land. This railroad will serve as a catalyst for prosperity, benefiting not only the present generation but also generations yet to come. Gringotts Bank recognizes the immense potential this railroad holds for the development of industries, the expansion of markets, and the facilitation of trade. As a trusted financial institution, we are committed to supporting the businesses and individuals who will thrive in this new era of connectivity. Our financial services, including loans, investments, and secure storage facilities, will be available to fuel growth and ensure the success of ventures linked to this transformative infrastructure. This nearly sent the crowd over the edge. Already, the idea of going west was big for many people. But to also have the ability for financial help from Gringotts was an added bonus in their books, that made many want to head straight home and start packing while thinking of what business they would open. Having to wait nearly 5 whole minutes for the crowd to fall back to a rumble, Montgomery plastered a wide smile on his face as he looked the crowd over. We must also take a moment to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts of the countless individuals who dedicated their skills, labor, and expertise to bring this grand vision to life. From the engineers and laborers who toiled tirelessly on the construction sites to the visionaries who conceived this audacious plan, we owe them a debt of gratitude. Their unwavering commitment and determination have made this historic endeavor a reality. This time, loud hoots and hollers came from the back of the gathered people. They were some of the workers of the railroad. As we witness the inaugural journey of the Transcontinental Railroad, let us not only celebrate its completion and those who brought it to fruition, but let us also recognize the profound impact it will have on our nation's future. Today, we stand united, bridging geographical divides and forging new paths towards progress and prosperity. Again the crowd roared. Raising his hands, Montgomery couldn't help but chuckle as the energy emanating from the crowd was palpable. On behalf of Gringotts Bank, may this remarkable achievement serve as a reminder of the boundless possibilities that lie before us when we dare to dream big and work together towards a shared vision. Thank you, and may this day mark the beginning of a new era of growth, unity, and prosperity for the United States of America. With those words, bags of red, white and blue confetti were thrown up and into the air, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Turning my head, I spoke to Julius, Jane, and Carlyle, all of whom sat in the comfortable chairs I had placed in a shaded area under a canopy where all of the city's richest and head political figures sat, including America's President, Abraham Lincoln. What did you think of the speech? I asked. It was good, Julius said, nodding his head. Not something I would have written, but hey, I'm no poet. I nodded my head. Good, I said with a small laugh. It was meant to get the crowd riled up, not to lull them to sleep like poetry would have. He gave me a deadpan look. You know you are not funny, right? He asked, leaning forward to look past Jane, who was seated between us. I have my moments. I chuckled, as all of the aristocrats that surrounded us stood from their seats and started to make their rounds. Turning, I watched as Montgomery waved at the crowd as he walked off the stage. He is quite skilled, Carlyle noted from my left. I looked at him. Not only is he skilled in his speeches, he is also a prodigy when it comes to business. I said with a smirk. Has there ever been a Rothschild who has never been a prodigy when it came to business? Carlyle chuckled. Not that I know, I said, also chuckling. Adam, how was your trip to Russia? Jane asked from my right side. You spent what, a little over 2 decades there. Turning my head, I smiled at her. It couldn't have been better. And I did. She raised one of her brows. But before she could speak, Julius leaned forward and spoke before her. I had to bite my lip not to laugh as she rolled her eyes. Yes, Adam, you never mentioned why you wanted a bank built there. Julius said, as he scooted forward in his chair. We didn't even know you were in Russia until you sent that letter. Julius added. Russia is an untapped well of resources, we would have been dumb not to have gotten ourselves involved there eventually. I said. Julius narrowed his eyelids as he looked at me. If there is one thing I know, Adam, it's that you tend to want banks built in places for reasons that don't involve money or gains. What is the real reason? He asked. Now all of them were looking at me in curiosity. Letting out a sigh, I took off my top hat and swept my hair back before putting it back on. Let's just say I went there to take care of some business with 2 very stupid individuals and decided the people there could use some help, which would help avoid certain things from happening later on. I said simply. Good evening, gentlemen and miss, a deep voice said from our left. Turning our heads, we all looked up at the large figure of the 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. Standing to our feet, we greeted him. Mr. President, what a pleasure it is to meet you. Julius said in a refined English accent. Ah, Mr. Meneses, it is an honor. Abraham said, as he and Julius shook hands. Unlike previously in my old history, there was a notable lack of stress in his life. Because unlike previously, there was no civil war that weighed heavily on his presidency. Instead he was at the helm of a much smaller war, which was in the process of coming to an end after the US's numerous victories. And this must be your wife. Abraham said, as he delicately took Jane's hand in a quick shake. Yes, this is my wife, Jane. A pleasure. Abraham said. I must again thank you for your foundries and the steel they sent here for the creation of the Transcontinental Railroad. Abraham said. Not at all, Mr. President. Julius said with a wide smile. Adam, if I may have a word. Carlyle said from beside me, taking my attention away from the conversation Julius was having with one of the most significant presidents the US ever had. I turned to look at him and saw a slight bit of worry in his eyes. Sure, I said as I followed him. By this time, the sun was starting to fall over the horizon. That added with a slight cloud overcast, we were able to walk out from under the canopy. Stepping away from any groups of people, Carlyle started to talk. I have a question, Adam. What is it? I asked. I wish to start my own coven. Carlyle said in a rush. I took a moment at that. His own coven. Is this it? The creation of the Cullen Coven? I thought in wonder. Why do you wish to start your own coven? I asked, playing the part of the unknowing. There is a longing in my heart. Carlyle said, before he paused to gather his thoughts. You, Julius, and Jane, are like family to me. You, Adam, are a well of wisdom and experience that is like an older brother to me. Julius is like the serious middle child who takes everything seriously. Carlyle said with a laugh. And Jane, she's the caring sister. I nodded my head at his words. But I wish for more. A true family. Carlyle said. I gave him a small smile. I understand, Carlyle. I said simply. My response seemed to surprise him. Really? He asked. I nodded. Yes, Carlyle. You wish to start your own family. I said, patting him on the shoulder. How did you? He stammered. I let out a laugh. Carlyle, you are hands down the most compassionate vampire I have ever met. It was only a matter of time before you made this decision. And I can't blame you for wanting more. I added. Me, you, Jane, and Julius might be as close as siblings, but we aren't exactly a coven. I tend to disappear for decades on end. Julius is too in love with running Gringotts to be interested in actually being part of a real coven, and Jane is simply content where she is with Julius. So I can see why you would want more. I said with a grin. I didn't think you would be so receptive to this. Carlyle said. I gave him a raised brow. Carlyle, when have I ever stopped you from doing something you wanted to do? I said, giving him a playful shove. Back in town. New York. 1933. Years in world greater than 5,930. Thank God. I thought as I stepped off the gangplank and onto the hard concrete. I hope you had a good trip, sir. A well-dressed sailor said in a heavy German accent. He stood at the bottom of the gangplank biting farewells to the passengers of the SS Bremen. I did, thank you. I said with a smile, as I readjusted the suitcase in my hand, before continuing through the dock to one of the many busy roads of New York. Looking around, I was amazed at how much has changed in so little time. Around the year 1900, I decided to take a trip. First, I stopped off in Germany to deal with a certain someone. I didn't kill them like most people in my old world might have. Instead, I made sure he would never walk again. Maybe now he can actually become a good painter instead of an insane person. I'll still have people watching over him just in case. From there, I made my way to Australia, then through many of the islands over there like the Philippines. From there, I made my way to Hawaii. Which was a wonderful idea. It had been way too long since I had taken some time to myself. Some days, I would simply sit on a beautiful beach with a coconut in hand. Minus the umbrella. I also got the chance to meet Queen Liliuokalani, the Queen of Hawaii, which totally blew my mind. Before I actually came to the islands, I never knew Hawaii used to be a monarchy. But like time, it was time to move on. I ended up taking a voyage all the way from Hawaii to California, where I got on the SS Bremen, which brought me to New York. Raising my hand, I waved at a bright yellow checker cab, which was a Hudson Terraplane. The cab quickly pulled off and onto the side of the road. Giving the driver a quick nod of the head, I opened the back door and slid my suitcase across the seat before sliding in. Where to, mister? The driver asked. 5th Avenue, please. Sure thing, the man said. Where are you from? I asked the man in Italian as I looked him over, using the rearview mirror to do so. Turning his head, the man glanced at me over his shoulder for a moment, giving me a wide smile. I'm from Sicily. What about you? He asked as we stopped at an intersection. I used to live in Rome for some time. I said, not telling the man it was nearly 2 millennia ago. Lived. You're not Italian? He asked. I shook my head as he looked into the rearview mirror. No. I said with a small chuckle. I just used to live there for a number of years. The man nodded his head a few times. You must be good with languages because if you didn't say anything, I would have thought you were an Italian. The rest of the ride was filled with small talk about Italy and how nowhere else on earth could make a better wine than them. He even mentioned how it was still adjusting to being in America. When we pulled in front of the building I had instructed him to park in front of, I took out a large bundle of bills from my suit pocket and removed 4 $100 bills. Here, I said, leaning forward. The man stared at the bills for a solid minute before he looked at me. Sir? He asked, confused. Take it. It's for you. I know it's not easy starting a new life in a new country. I said, shaking my hand with the bills. Are you sure? He asked. I nodded my head. Take the money, would ya? I said with a chuckle. Slowly raising his hand, he took the bills. That wasn't so hard now, was it? I asked him, as I grabbed my suitcase, while giving his shoulder a pat. Have a good day, Mr. Angelo. I said quickly as I grabbed my suitcase and slid out onto the sidewalk. Sir. The taxi driver's voice stopped me. Turning, I watched as he continued to crank his window down. I won't forget this, he shouted over the loud street noise. Raising my hand, I tapped the edge of my cap as I bowed my head. Then maybe one day I might need your help, Tommy. I said, giving the man a smile as his mouth opened in surprise. He had never told me his first name, but I figured it out. Turning back, I entered the building through ornate revolving doors. Stepping in, I looked at the opulent lobby, filled with finery. From the polished marble floors to the wooden walls and golden inlays on the ceiling. Walking to the reception, I waited in line for a spot to open. Good evening, sir, how may I help you today? A young brunette asked, as she gave me a wide smile. Not seeming to be affected by her charm, I spoke. Yes, I'm here to meet a Mr. Carlisle Cullen. Could you tell me which room he is in? I asked her, setting my case on the ground by my feet. I'm sorry, sir, but it's against policy to give away our residents' apartment numbers. But I can give him a call. If he says it's okay, I would be more than happy to give it to you. I nodded my head as she picked up a rotary phone and started spinning the dial. Good afternoon, Mr. Cullen. Sorry for disturbing you, but I have a gentleman here who is here to see you. Really? And what is the name of this man? I heard Carlisle ask through the phone. Dropping the phone to her shoulder, the girl gave me a small smile as she asked. And what is your name, sir? I smiled back. Adam Gray. Bringing the phone back up, she told him the name. The phone went silent for a moment before Carlisle gave her the affirmative to send me up. He is in the apartment sweatsuit on the 43rd floor, the girl said as she gestured to the elevators on the side of the large reception area. Thank you for your time, I said with a small smile, as I grabbed my suitcase and made my way there. Reaching the top floor, I walked down the hall that only had one door in it. As I walked down the hall, the door swung open, and a smiling Carlisle stood there beaming at me. It's been too long, Adam, he said as I made it to the door, and we embraced in a tight hug. That it has, I said, patting his back a few times before we separated. How have you been, kid? I asked. I've never been better, Carlisle said with a wide smile. I can see that, I said with a laugh. Just look at that smile, I said, as we both began to laugh. Please come in, Carlisle said as he stepped to the side to let me in. There is someone I want you to meet. Carlisle's discovery. I found myself seated in a luxurious leather chair, patiently waiting for what seemed like an eternity. It had been over 9 hours since I had taken an action that I never anticipated I would. The thought of doing nothing weighed heavily on my mind, and I couldn't shake it off. The vivid memories of Edward's mother pleading with me to save her son played on a loop in my mind's eye as I sat waiting. As well as the startling discovery, she revealed. The Masons had been familiar faces in my life for several years, mere acquaintances who occasionally brought young Edward to the hospital where I had dedicated nearly a decade to. They were a pleasant enough family, their love for their only child evident in every interaction. Edward reciprocated that love with all his heart. But as with most things in life, no one emerges unscathed from its treacherous grip. On that fateful day, June 15, 1918, the Cullen family arrived at the hospital, displaying symptoms of the Spanish influenza. The disease had ensnared them in its clutches, relentlessly deteriorating their health despite my best efforts. The first to succumb to the illness was Edward Mason Sr. He passed away peacefully in his sleep, his final hours consumed by delirium induced by the fever. The following morning, Elizabeth Mason teetered on the brink of death herself. It was sheer luck that I happened to be by her bedside, assessing her condition when she mustered the strength to confide in me. I know what you are, Dr. Cullen, she wheezed, her breaths labored and lips parched. I looked down at her, confusion etched on my face. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mason, I questioned, hoping to grasp the meaning behind her cryptic words. A whimsical smile danced on her lips as she replied, Don't attempt to deceive me, Dr. Cullen. I know your true nature. Her accusation hung in the air, and I discreetly scanned the hospital ward, ensuring no one overheard her revelation. Returning my gaze to her, I adopted a solicitous tone and inquired, And what am I, Mrs. Mason? Summoning the last vestiges of her strength, she used her elbows to prop herself up from the bed, fixing her eyes on mine as if peering into the depths of my soul. With a resolute tone, she uttered two simple words that sent a chill down my spine: a vampire. I involuntarily gulped out of reflex. You're not in your right mind, Mrs. Mason. You must rest and focus on getting better, I urged gently, attempting to guide her back onto the bed. However, she gripped my hand tightly like a vice, her nails clawing at my stone-like skin. Do not lie, she exclaimed sternly, her unwavering gaze never leaving mine. My family has known of your kind's existence for generations, she continued, her eyes momentarily losing focus before she drew a deep breath and resumed her account. My grandfather regaled me with stories in childhood. Generations before our arrival in America, an ancestor and his brother were adopted by a mysterious man who saved them from certain death after their town was ravaged by an attack. He raised them as his own, and together, they journeyed across many lands until he brought them to England, where they eventually settled. Her narrative consumed my thoughts in an instant. Could it be? I wondered, my mind filled with wonder and intrigue. Her story began to align with one that I was intimately acquainted with. As I looked down at her, I witnessed her life slowly slipping away from her eyes. Kneeling by her bedside, urgency lacing my voice, I posed the only question that mattered at that moment. What is your maiden name? I implored. A soft smile graced her lips as she whispered, Gray. Her eyes grew vacant, and the last remnants of air escaped her lungs. The grip she had on my hand gradually weakened until her hand lay limp in mine. Slowly, I lowered her hand onto the bed, my mind racing with a torrent of thoughts. She was a Gray, a descendant of Adam's adoptive family, I silently thought. Rising to my feet, I strode purposefully across the hospital towards the ward housing the other patients afflicted by the influenza. Passing rows of beds and gaunt faces, the cramped space filled with the symphony of suffering, I finally reached my destination, the room where Edward lay. Drawing the white curtain closed, I turned to face him. It was already evident that he was beyond any help I could offer. The young man emitted a low groan as he clutched at his blanket, beads of sweat glistening on his feverish face. Kneeling beside his bed, I studied him intently. I had watched Edward grow from a young boy into the young man lying before me now. To discover that he was a descendant of Adam's adoptive family added a layer of complexity to the situation. Uncertainty and doubt plagued my mind. What was the right course of action? Could I simply stand by and let him succumb to this illness? I blinked, attempting to push the memories aside, as I saw Edward's eyes flutter open. He lay perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the ceiling of my home. Then, slowly, his eyes shifted to meet mine, and I was struck by the sight of his blood-red irises and the unmistakable panic etched on his face. Slowly, I raised my hands. It's good to see you awake, Edward. I said calmingly. Dr. Cullen. Edward asked in confusion. What's happening? I took a moment to think of what I was to say. Ah! Edward yelped as he put his hands to his ears. I sat forward in a panic. Edward, are you ALR? I tried to get out but was interrupted by Edward's panicked words. The voices. Edward managed to get out through gritted teeth. The voices. I thought in confusion. We were currently in my home in the Gold Coast district of Chicago. The buildings were side by side in rows. But using my own hearing, I couldn't hear anything through the thick brick walls but soft murmurs from my neighbors, which is why I chose this place. It was quiet. AHHG. Edward yelped again. Edward, you need to tell me what is happening so I can help you. I said, standing to my feet. People's voices, they are in my head. Good to see you in Revelations. Stepping into the nicely decorated entrance hall, I gave Carlyle a smile. Who would have thought you would be one for the fancier things in life? I said jokingly, as he smiled back at me. What can I say? Forever is a long time, so why not live in a little comfort? And I didn't pick the place. Carlyle added with a small chuckle. Oh, and who picked the place then? I asked as we walked out of the hall and into a large open living room, which was richly designed, with finery and expensive-looking furniture. What caught my eye was the youngish-looking woman standing in the middle of the living room, wearing a nice black dress with a waist belt. Adam, I would like for you to meet my mate, Esme. Carlyle said, sounding uncertain. I smiled as I set my suitcase on the ground. Carlyle. I said with a wide smile. Looking at her, I couldn't help but smile inwardly as well. It seems things are still falling into place the way they are meant to. I thought. Taking a few steps forward, I outstretched my hand. It is very nice to finally meet you, Adam. Esme said as she softly shook my hand. Carlyle has told me much about you, he added. And you, Esme. I said, giving her a shake of the hand. I hope Carlyle hasn't been telling tall tales about me. I said with a chuckle. Let me show you to your room, Adam. Carlyle said, gesturing for me to follow him down a hall that was connected to the living room with a smile and a chuckle. Grabbing my case, I followed after them as Esme and him walked down a hallway. Making our way down the hall, I looked at the interesting pieces of art that hung on the walls of the hallway. Hey, this is one of my pieces. I said, surprised. That it is. Carlyle said. The artwork showed the city of Rome, which I painted around 1100 AD. The artwork was still in great shape and still held most of the vibrant colors I like to add to most of my artwork. Right next to the painting that was hung on the wall was a door that was cracked open. Taking a glance through the small crack, I could see shelves of books. Is this your study, Carlyle? I asked as I turned to look at him. Carlyle and Esme both froze for the slightest of milliseconds before they smiled at me. No, that room belongs to Edward. Carlyle said with a small awkward smile. Edward? I asked, sounding confused, even though I knew well who he was. They looked at each other quickly before they looked at me. Adam, there is something I need to tell you. Carlyle said, now sounding worried. I raised one of my brows at them, curious at what could make Carlyle act so worried. Please, love, let's get him settled before we start. Esme said, turning to give Carlyle a stern look. Yes. Good idea. Carlyle said, clapping his hands together to disperse the slight tension that filled the air. My room was nice, with a twin-sized bed and a wall closet for my belongings. Gently sitting my case on the bed, I unbuttoned my expensive black jacket and then hung it in the closet before I walked back to the living room. But as I made my way there, I couldn't help but stop and push the door to Edward's room open. Looking inside, I saw the whole of one side of his room was full with books, filling floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. The other side simply held a single-person bed and a lounge chair that looked heavily used. Closing the door, I finished making my way down the hall. Stepping into the living room, I saw Carlyle standing by the window while Esme walked into the room holding a teacup and saucer. If we knew you were coming, I would have gotten something better than this. Esme said with a smile as she handed me the cup. This was left by the previous owners, she added. This is quite all right, I said, bringing the cup up to smell. Chamomile. It's one of my favorites, I said, taking a sip. Walking to one of the leather chairs in the room, I took a seat. So, what is it you wanted to tell me? I asked, setting the cup and saucer down on a side table. Wanting to get to the meat of Carlyle's apparent worries. Carlyle turned away from the window and looked at me. It's about Edward, Carlyle said, getting right to it. I raised a brow. What about him? I asked, not wanting him to stall. He is a member of my coven. The first, he said, walking away from the window to sit next to Esme on a fancy-looking sofa. I'm the one who turned him. He continued once he had sat. I nodded my head. And, you thought I would be mad about that? I asked inquiringly. Not about that, Carlyle said as he fidgeted with a gold ring on his finger. Then what? I asked with a chuckle. Edward's last name at birth was Mason. But his mother's maiden name was Gray. Now that's unexpected, I thought, as a mix of confused emotions ran through me. I managed to trace her family lineage back to England and to your family. Carlyle said, still sounding hesitant. I didn't say anything for a few moments as I thought about all of this. What are the odds? I couldn't help but think. Taking another sip of the tea. Does he know about me? I asked. No. Not yet, at least. He hasn't had the easiest time adapting to this life. Esme said. Esme began but seemed unable to finish her sentence. He has the same issue I had when I first turned. Carlyle finished for her. Edward believes that being a vampire is bad because it means having to live forever while constantly battling his instinct to drink human blood. He sees himself as a monster and fears the potential harm he could cause to those around him. Additionally, having to hide his true nature from the human world makes him feel isolated and disconnected from others. Carlyle said. And have you tried to talk to him about it? I asked. Of course I have. But it's as if my words never stick. He says he understands, but he never seems able to leave his depression. I nodded my head slowly. And where is he now? I asked. Both Esme and Carlyle looked at each other. For the past few months, he has been living on his own. Carlyle said. Why is that? He has begun to drink human blood, so he thought it would be best to be on his own for now. Carlyle said. He goes after the bad guys. The killers, rapists, and scum that fill this city. Carlyle said as he shook his head. I guess it's a way for him to feel less like the monster he thinks he is. Confronting shadows. 1 week later. Stepping into the movie theater, I saw the movie was already underway. Taking off my hat, I took a seat at the back of the large theater. The movie was Frankenstein's Bride. The movie had only been out for about a week and seemed to be a hit. I wouldn't know, because surprisingly, I wasn't much for movies anymore like I might have once been. My guess was the over 5,000 years I went without it. Looking around, I looked for the one I had come to find. Like a hawk, it only took me a few seconds to hone in on my query. Seated by the main aisle, I saw the tall skinny figure of Edward Cullen. He seemed captivated by the movie, but I knew he had more on his mind than just the movie. I had followed him from his apartment in Brooklyn to Manhattan where we currently sit. Stretching my back, I tried to get comfortable in the small chairs, wishing I had bought some popcorn on the way in. The movie went on for about 30 minutes, before a woman stood from her seat, probably on her way to the washroom. As she walked by, a tall skinny man also stood, following after her. I smirked as I watched Edward. All the way, Edward watched the man move, clearly reading his thoughts, knowing what his sinister plan was. As the man walked out of the theater, Edward was hot in his tracks, following after him. With leisure, I stood from my seat, adjusting my new suit and overcoat. Dusting off my hat, I put it on. Times are starting to get interesting. I thought to myself as I followed Edward. Walking through the ornate halls of the high-end theater, I could hear as Edward struck the man. The slightest gasp escaped the man's lungs as Edward drank from him. Turning a corner in the wall, I saw as Edward separated from the man's neck. Making sure to walk as softly as possible, I managed to get about 5 feet behind Edward, before he managed to sense my presence. With the speed of a vampire, he turned in panic to see me standing there. His eyes were wide as he stared into my blue eyes. But as he stared, his eyes only grew wider and wider. "It's good to finally meet ya, kid," I said cheerily as I gave him a wide smile. Edward didn't say anything, but instead, took on a look of concentration. "I would stop trying to read my mind before you hurt yourself," I said with a chuckle. "It won't work." Reaching up, I grabbed my handkerchief from my inner jacket pocket and held it out. "Here, you have something on your face," I said, gesturing at my lip with my free hand. Edward stared at the handkerchief for a moment, before slowly taking it from my grip. Wiping the blood from his mouth, he handed it back. I shook my head. "Keep it. I have spares," I said with a smile as I patted my chest where I actually had 2 others. Confusedly, Edward shoved the handkerchief into his overcoat's pocket. During all of this, Edward had never removed his eyes from mine. "You won't be able to read my mind. Just give it a rest, huh?" I said, looking away from him and down at the dead body. "What do you normally do now?" I asked. "Just leave them where they fall or," I asked, looking back at Edward who still looked mildly confused. He said, unable to continue. "I'll take that as a leave them as they fall," I said cheekily, before looking around. "We should get a move on. Last thing we want is for one of the movies to end and people find us standing over a dead body," I said, walking past Edward and down the stairs. As I went down the steps, Edward stood still, in what I can only call shock. Reaching the last step, I heard Edward start to follow. Stopping, I reached into another of my pockets and pulled out a $50 bill while I waited for Edward. Stopping next to me, I could feel Edward's gaze. Looking over at him, I raised a brow. "What?" I asked, but before giving him time to speak, I started to move again, following the delicious smell that filled the large concession area that filled most of the bottom entrance floor. Walking with purpose, I made my way to the register area where a teen stood. Slapping the $50 bill on the counter, I look up at the surprised cashier. "I'll take your largest popcorn, 3 milk duds, 2 red hots, 1 black licorice, and all the 3 musketeers you have, oh. And all of the Kit Kats," I said, pointing out each item as I said their name. To the kid's credit, he managed to grab what I wanted in order and without falling behind. As he rang everything up on the large metal register, I snapped my fingers together. "I nearly forgot. Also add 2 Coca-Colas while you're at it," I said. Grabbing all of my goodies from the counter, I shoved them in all of my pockets. "And here is your change, sir. $40.52. I looked up at the teen's hand which was holding the change as I grabbed the 2 glass bottles of soda from the counter. "It's all yours, Marlon," I said, looking down at his gold name tag. Giving the teen a smile, I walked towards the front door, Edward still following. Twisting off the caps of both bottles, I handed one to Edward. Here, have this. I said. He looked down at it, confused, but still took it anyway. Taking a sip of the sweet beverage, I let out a sound of satisfaction. Oh, that's some good shit, I said, using my free hand to dig into my pocket, pulling out a box of musketeers. Who are you? Edward asked, not needing to look as he moved around a group of people walking by. I'm Adam. Nice to finally meet you, Edward. I said, not looking at him as I opened the small candy box with the 3 small bars of chocolate. Edward came to a complete halt. How do you know my name? He asked, rather aggressively as I picked up the sound of his bottle starting to crack with his pent-up rage. Whoa, there. Don't waste a good drink. I said, snatching the full bottle from Edward's cold grip, replacing it with my empty one. And to answer your question, I know your name because Carlyle told it to me. I said, continuing my walk east towards the docks of Manhattan. You know Carlyle? Edward asked. Longer than you have, I said whimsically as I took a sip of the new soda. I'm sorry. Edward asked questioningly. I looked at him. About what? I asked. What you just said, he said, as we walked to the otherwise of a road. That I've known Carlyle longer than you. I asked, playing dumb. Yes. Edward sighed, getting annoyed. What about it? I asked, walking into a dark alley. As we stepped in, I heard as Edward's anger finally bubbled to the surface, causing him to crush the glass bottle under his grip. Enough. Edward sighed, grabbing me by the shoulder with a grip that would have broken every bone of a normal human. Who are you, really? He snapped. I stayed facing away from him, and downed my soda in one go. Finishing it off, I tossed it to the side to crash against the alley's wall. You know the issue with drinking human blood? I asked Edward. He didn't say anything. It clouds your mind and judgment, makes you impulsive and quick to anger. Then, before Edward had time to understand what was happening, I broke from his grip and circled around behind him, grabbing the collar of his shirt and jacket like a dog before I jumped upwards between the 2 buildings. Grabbing onto the ledge of one of the buildings with my free hand, I used it to toss us up 10 feet over the building where I dropped Edward to the building. Landing on the hard stone of the building, I turned to look at the city around us, keeping an eye on the crouched figure of Edward from the corner of my eye. How did you do that? Edward yelled, standing to his feet. I looked at him with a shrug. Don't know. Just been able to as long as I can remember. I said with a chuckle, turning back to look over the city. And how long would that be? He asked, seeming to get his emotions back under control, even if just slightly. I didn't look at him as I spoke. Nearly 6,000 years. I could sense Edward's body go dead still. You're a vampire? He asked, confused and alarmed. I looked at him like he was stupid. You can hear my heart's beat and the warmth emitting from me. Then what are you? He asked, seeming ready to run at any minute. I shrugged again. Depends on who you ask. I said with a chuckle. To some I'm the ancestor to all humans. The great progenitor. While to others, like myself, I'm just some unlucky bastard dropped head first into this world with immortality and abilities I couldn't understand. Edward must be just like his movie self, because he connected the dots a lot quicker than anyone I had met before. Adam, ancestor to all humans, he said to himself, as if I wasn't there. Then, I saw it. The moment he understood who I was. I turned to face him, as he slowly took a step backwards. No. Edward sighed, his eyes ablaze with a sea of emotions. Confusion, rage, surprise, disgust, sadness, then one that surprised me. Hope. You can't be. Edward sighed, vulnerability seeming to wash over him. I turned my head slightly to the side. Does that scare you? I asked, seeming to catch him off guard with the question. I smiled as I saw the slightest twitch of his right brow. I thought so. I said. Stop it. He shouted. You can't be, he repeated, voice trembling, yet there was an undercurrent of something stronger, defiance. I stepped closer, my gaze unwavering. Why is that so hard to believe? You've seen more impossible things in your short life than most humans can imagine. Edward snarled, his lips pulling back to reveal his teeth. Don't patronize me. You're just another monster with a fancy story. Nothing more. A chuckle escaped my lips, not out of amusement but out of a deep-rooted understanding. You're not wrong. But you, Edward, should know better than anyone that not all monsters are created equal. Don't, he snapped, taking a step back. Don't talk to me like you know me. You don't know anything about me or what I've been through. I tilted my head, my expression softening just a fraction. I know more than you think. Carlyle talked about you, he cares about you deeply. Carlyle doesn't understand, Edward spat, the words thick with bitterness. He believes in fairy tales. He thinks we can live without blood, without giving in to what we are. But we're not human anymore. We're predators. And what about Esme? I countered, my voice firm but gentle. Does she believe in fairy tales too? Or does she just believe in you? Edward flinched at my words, a shadow passing over his face. She's too kind for her own good. I nodded slowly. She is. And she deserves better than to see you like this, lost and alone. His eyes blazed with anger. I'm not lost. I know exactly what I'm doing. Do you? I asked, the question hanging heavy between us. Do you really know, or are you just running from the guilt, the shame of what you've become and done? Edward's fists clenched, the sound of his knuckles cracking echoing in the night. You think you can just waltz in here and fix me? That you can make everything right with a few pretty words? I stood my ground, my eyes never leaving his. No, Edward. I don't think I can fix you. But I'm not here to fix you. I'm here to remind you of who you could be. Of what you left behind. A bitter laugh tore from his throat. And what's that? A life of pretending. Of lying to ourselves that we can be something we're not. I took a step closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper. No, Edward. A life of hope. A life where you don't have to be alone. A life where you can still find redemption. He shook his head, the defiance in his eyes wavering. Redemption. For monsters like us. You really are delusional. Maybe, I conceded. But I've seen enough in my time to know that redemption isn't about what we are or have done. It's about what we choose to be and do moving on in life. Edward looked away, his shoulders slumping just a fraction. And what if I can't choose? What if this is all I'm meant to be? I sighed, the weight of millennia pressing down on my own shoulders. That's a decision only you can make, Edward. But running from it won't make it any easier. He looked back at me, his eyes haunted. And what if I don't want to go back? What if I can't face them? Then you'll keep running, I said simply, and you'll never find peace. You know where I'll be in dinner. Look, Edward, I said as a gust of wind ruffled our coats while bringing the sounds and smells of the city with it. You can take my words as you want. But, if you want to keep talking and learn why I'm even here trying to help you, you know where Carlyle, Esme, and I will be. I said, disappearing before Edward's eyes, landing back into the alleyway. Readjusting the hat on my head, then my coat, I walked out of the alleyway and back into the slowly dwindling crowds of late-night goers. As I walked, I had to dodge couples out on dates and drunks stumbling along. Look out, buddy. A checkered taxi yelled as a drunk stumbled into the road. Blocking all of the sound out, I thought back on the talk I just had with Edward. My original plan was to let him come back naturally on his own. But to find out he was a part of my adopted family, I just couldn't. At first, it wasn't that big of a problem to me, but as I called Julius and had him check into it, I found a rather startling detail. The Gray family name was nearly gone. And apparently, it has been for some time now. Which was an oversight on my part, but was also unavoidable. Disease, accidents, and marriage split the family up greatly. At this point, there was just an old gentleman by the name of Beltran Gray, who still carried it that was related to Gerard or Oliver. And from what I heard from Julius, the man never had children due to an accident in his younger years and was now 80 years old and running on fumes. That wasn't to say that there weren't still any living members of the family, just very distant relations with different last names. As I walked, I spotted a cozy-looking brick restaurant squished between two larger clothing stores. Figuring I could use a bite to eat, I headed in. The atmosphere inside was warm, filled with conversation, light laughter, and clouds of smoke. Seeing an empty table, I took a seat. Taking my hat off, I sat it in the corner of the table while I waited for one of the waitresses to notice me. As I did so, I dug around one of my jacket pockets, pulling out a silver-engraved cigarette holder and a fancy flick lighter. I didn't start smoking for the nicotine, but instead to fit in better with my surroundings, like now. I myself couldn't get that nicotine high or whatever smokers got out of smoking. I also didn't get any of the downsides either, so it wasn't that big of a deal for me. Tapping the cigarette a few times on the silver holder, I stuck it between my lips and started to light the end when a woman stepped up to my table. "Good evening, sir, what can I get you?" she asked. At the moment, all I was able to see was her lower half as I lit the end of the cigarette. Looking up, I saw a pretty young woman, perhaps in her very early 20s. She wore a dark navy blue knee-length dress with a matching blouse. It was of simple design, but she seemed to make it look elegant. She had black hair tied in a long braid that went down her back and large light blue eyes. What's the special here? I asked, stumbling over my words before taking a drag of the cigarette, embarrassed. Steak and potatoes, she said, giving me a coy smile. I'll take that then, I said, smiling back politely, or tried to, but I think I just looked like a buffoon. Sure thing, she said with a chuckle. And what would you like to drink? I pondered that for a moment. Water was out of the question. I don't know about you, but rusty pipe wasn't a favorite flavor of mine, so I went with the safe option. Whatever you have on tap will be fine. Giving me another smile and a small wink, the young woman turned and headed back through the crowded room. Talk about a view. Looking over, I saw a newspaper lying forgotten on the table next to mine. Grabbing it, I kicked back and started to read through it as I waited for my food to come out. As well as an attempt to get my mind off the waitress. What can I say? It's been a while since I spent the night with a woman. The news was dry, and didn't have anything that really drew my attention, which was good. By the time my food came out, I was halfway through the comic strips that filled the last pages of the newspaper. Setting down the paper, I watched as the young woman sat the steaming plate in front of me. Here you are, sir. She said before walking away, not even giving me another glance. The view was amazing, but so was the smell of my food. For a place like this, their food was pretty good. It wasn't until I was halfway done with my food that I realized I also had a large mug of a dark ale sitting by my plate. I drank half before I continued with my food. Letting out a burp, I leaned back in my chair, taking out a milk dud pack from my pocket for dessert. You know we sell sweets, right? The familiar voice of my waitress said, startling me from my after-meal bliss. I looked up at her. But do you sell milk duds? I asked, raising the box and shaking it. She put a hand on her hip and looked down at me. And oh my goodness, was she pretty. A few of her hairs had come undone from her braid and hung down over her forehead, giving her a charming tousled look. No, we don't have those. Then she gave me a smile. We have something even better. I sat forward in my chair, a bewildered look on my face. I'm sorry, miss, but I just can't see anything ever beating a milk dud. I said, shaking my head, popping another one in my mouth. The truth was that, in my opinion, milk duds were a mid-tier candy. They just so happened to be the first thing I grabbed from my pocket. I just wanted to try and start a conversation. She gave me a dazzling smile. I think I can change your mind about that, she said, turning and walking back to the front bar area. Seeming to put a little extra sway in her steps. A moment later, she came back with what looked like a piece of pie. Oh no, my kryptonite. I thought as she set this plate in front of me. Steam rose up from the dish. Fuck, I thought, stopping myself from licking my lips. I looked up at her. You were right. About what? She asked with a knowing grin. You did have something that could change my mind. Early mornings. I woke early the next morning, well rested from my 4 hours of sleep. Opening the door to my room, I ambled along to the bathroom to take care of my morning business. I had long since not cared that everyone could hear the human fact about my life, but when you're nearly 6,000 years old, you tend to have no more fucks to give. Smacking my lips a few times, I looked myself over in the mirror. My hair was a mess, and a line of dried drool stained my chin. Using my hands I got my shortened hair into a semblance of order, then washed my face. Opening the door, I stepped into the hallway. I could hear both Carlyle and Esme moving around in the kitchen, so I made my way there. Stepping into the kitchen in just my pajama pants, I watched as Esme and Carlyle pulled food, utensils, plates, and other necessities from large paper sacks and boxes that were lining their counters. What's all this? I asked, looking around. Food and cooking supplies, Esme said cheerily, giving me a wide smile as she pulled a large metal frying pan from a white box like it weighed no more than a feather. I nodded my head in appreciation. Walking to the nice refrigerator, I pulled the lever and opened it. Nice, I said, pulling a large glass bottle of milk from the fridge. Twisting off the cap, I took a large gulp. Adam, dear, we put glasses in that cabinet over there. Esme said, pointing past me to a part of the kitchen which only had countertop and cabinets lining the wall. Her tone was gentle, but also held a slight chiding tone one would expect from a mother. I looked at the cabinet then at the bottle. Right, I said, giving her a smile as I turned to get a glass. Least I can do, I thought with a chuckle. No need to live up to my moniker of barbarian. Pouring the glass, I spoke. How was the night out? I asked, capping the bottle and turning to look at the both of them, leaning against the countertop. I saw that the both of you were out when I returned. It was good. Managed to get a few deers. Carlyle said, putting cutlery in one of the drawers. And, how was yours? Carlyle asked, acting as if he was asking a simple question, but I could hear the undertone in his voice. Better than expected, I said, downing the last of my glass. Both Esme and Carlyle looked up at me simultaneously. And, Esme asked, hope gleaming in her eyes. I shrugged. I think for the first quarter of our talk he was in too much shock to really grasp what was happening. But there at the end, I think I might have reached him. I said, walking to the sink to rinse out my cup. And, Carlyle asked, impatiently. I liked doing that to people for some reason. Stretching out the suspense until they were practically on the edge of their seats. It was a little game I played, a small pleasure in my otherwise monotonous life. Turning back to face them, I let a slow smile spread across my face. And, I continued, savoring the moment, I think I got him to consider coming here to talk. It's not a full commitment yet, but it's a step in the right direction. Esme's face lit up with relief and excitement. Carlyle's expression softened, and he approached me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. That's more than we could have hoped for, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. Your ability to connect with people, even after all these years, never ceases to amaze me. I shrugged again, trying to downplay it, but the warmth in their reactions made my heart swell a little. Well, someone's got to do the talking around here, I joked, winking at Esme. Besides, it's not like you two could have done it. You're too refined. Esme laughed, a light, musical sound that managed to lift the mood. You mean we're too uptight, she teased, nudging Carlyle playfully. Carlyle chuckled and shook his head. Perhaps. But that's why it's good to have you here, isn't it? To keep things interesting. I grinned, finishing up with the glass and placing it on the drying rack. Well, I suppose I do have a knack for shaking things up. Keeps me young, you know. Esme rolled her eyes playfully. As if being as old as Carlyle has told me you are isn't enough to keep you young. Touché, I conceded, leaning back and folding my arms with a chuckle. So, what's on the menu for today? Anything special? I asked, looking everything over. We thought we'd make a big breakfast, Esme replied, her eyes twinkling. Pancakes, bacon, eggs, the works. We want to make sure you're welfed. I raised an eyebrow. You know I can fend for myself, right? I said playfully. Of course, Carlyle said, but it's not every day we get to cook for someone. Consider it our way of saying welcome. I nodded, feeling a rare sense of warmth and belonging. All right then, let's get to it. Anything I can do to help. Esme handed me a whisk and a bowl of pancake batter. You can start with this. Just mix it until it's smooth. I took the bowl and started whisking, the simple act of preparing food oddly therapeutic. So, I said, breaking the silence, how long have you two been together? Carlyle glanced at Esme, a soft smile playing on his lips. A little over a decade now. We met in Ohio, if you can believe it. Ohio, huh? I said, laughing. Not exactly the most romantic place. It was to us, Esme said, her voice filled with emotion. We found each other when we needed it most. Sometimes, that's all it takes. I nodded, appreciating the sentiment. Well, I'm glad you did. You seem like a good match. Thank you, Carlyle said, his tone sincere. And we're glad to have you here, Adam. It's been refreshing, to say the least. I grinned. Refreshing, huh? That's one way to put it. As we continued to prepare breakfast together, the kitchen filled with the comforting sounds of sizzling bacon on new pans and the clinking of utensils. It was a simple, domestic scene, but for me, it felt like a rare treasure. Eventually, everything was ready, and we sat down at the table, the spread before us looking like something out of a dream. I dug in with enthusiasm, savoring every bite. Esme and Carlyle watched with amusement, their own plates untouched and empty. You know, I said between mouthfuls, you two really should try this sometime. It's amazing. I said jokingly. Esme laughed. We'll take your word for it. She said, playing along with my joke. I smirked. Suit yourselves. More for me. As the meal progressed, we fell into an easy rhythm of conversation, sharing stories and laughter. It was a moment of peace and connection, a brief respite from the endless march of time. And for the first time in a long while, I felt truly at ease. At least for that moment and the next 30 seconds that followed. Knock, knock, knock. We heard coming from the front door. All of our heads turned in the direction of the door, which was on the other side of the apartment, before we looked at each other. Gifts and what is this feeling? Both Carlise and Esme were standing and heading towards the door in a flash. But I didn't. I stood calmingly, and started walking like a normal person towards the door. Making my way into the living room, I could see down the hallway where Carlyle was opening the door. Standing there was a woman who I realized was the same woman from the front desk. "Good morning, Mr. Cullen. This package was delivered to the front desk for you," she said, handing over the package. As she handed it over, she glanced over Carlyle's shoulder, where she caught a glance of me standing there, shirtless. I could see as her eyes grew wide in surprise, and her cheeks grew red in a blush. I gave her a smirk, as Carlyle thanked her and softly closed the door in her face. Looking at Carlyle and Esme, I could see the sadness in their sharp glance. So to distract them, I asked, "So, what's in the package?" Even though I already knew. Walking into the living room, Carlyle set the package on a small desk that was along one wall. Pulling the twine string that was tied in a simple release knot, Carlyle and Esme's eyes scrunched in curiosity. After removing the knot and cardboard paper, they were graced with a finely lacquered and designed box. They looked at each other, confused. "Open it," I said from behind them, a smile plastered on my face. They both looked at me surprised. "Do you know what it is?" Carlyle asked. "Of course I do. It's a gift from me to the both of you," I said smugly. Esme gave me a warm smile that warmed my heart. "What for?" Carlyle asked, getting clear satisfaction from making me wait to see their reactions from my gift, just like I did to them earlier. I chuckled. "It's a late gift for your partnering," I said using air quotes. "Since you didn't exactly have a wedding, I can't say wedding gift, but that doesn't mean I can't get you a gift like I would have if you did." They both gave me smiles of appreciation. I waved my hand in the air. "Open it already, would ya? We're not getting any younger around here." Carlyle chuckled. "We also aren't getting any older, Adam," he said with a chuckle. "Semantics," I said, waving a hand for them to hurry it up. Pulling down the small gold latch that held the box closed, Carlyle slowly opened the lid. Inside, set on soft dark blue velvet, were two items. I could hear the soft intake of breath from Esme and Carlyle in surprise. Stepping close, I looked down into the box and smirked. "Nice, right?" I asked them. The two items were made from the finest of craftsmanship of their time. For Carlyle, I got him something I thought fit him well. It was the Patek Philippe Henry Graves Super Complication, which was just made not even 3 months ago. While for Esme, I really didn't hold back. Nestled on the blue velvet in the box, was a necklace that could put most others to shame. It was made of silver, and held diamonds all the way around. But in the front, rested a large light pink diamond, encased in a delicate silver filigree design. The pendant was breathtaking, with its intricate details and sparkling gemstones that circled the circumference of the large pink diamond. As I watched Carlyle and Esme's eyes widen in awe, I couldn't help but let out a chuckle. Esme reached out to touch the necklace with excitement. "Adam, this is absolutely stunning," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. I smiled, basking in their appreciation. "I'm glad you like it, Esme. I wanted to get you something that reflects your elegance and beauty," I said smoothly. Carlyle examined the large gold timepiece in his hands, his expression a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Adam, this is an extraordinary timepiece. How did you manage to get your hands on it?" I shrugged nonchalantly. "Well, let's just say I have my ways. I wanted to get you something that symbolizes your precision and dedication to your work." Both pieces were actually shoved in my personal bank vault here in New York. But they didn't need to know that. They both looked at each other, their eyes brimming with happiness. "Thank you, Adam," Carlyle said sincerely. "We truly appreciate your thoughtful gifts." I waved away their thanks. "It's the least I could do," I said with a chuckle. The rest of the morning and afternoon was full of comfortable conversations and stories. Carlyle got me to tell Esme about some of my escapades across Europe and other parts of the world. But as soon as it was dark enough, Carlyle and Esme headed out to do some hunting in the surrounding parts of the city that still held wildlife, while I headed out to a certain diner. Wrangling myself a cab, I made it to the diner just as the sun was setting. Stepping out, I tip the cab driver before I walk in, wearing a nice suit. Again, like the nights before, the room was full of patrons, laughing, smoking, and eating. Looking around, I saw my table was again empty, so I took a seat. It was only a matter of seconds before the same beautiful young woman, who I suddenly realized I didn't know the name of, came up to my table. It's good to see you here again, she said, giving me a smile that lit up the room. I returned her smile, feeling an unfamiliar flutter in my chest. Well, I couldn't resist the charm of this place. Or maybe it's just the pie, I quipped, trying to keep my tone casual. She laughed, a sound like silver bells. I'm sure it's the pie. Or maybe it's the company, she said, raising one of her perfectly sculpted brows. I smirked, leaning back in my chair. Ah, you got me. It's definitely the company. By the way, you never told me your name. Pretty sure it's not, hey, you, or, waitress, I said with a chuckle. She smirked, placing a hand on her hip. It's Evelyn. Evelyn Russo. And you? Adam, I said, extending my hand. Adam Smith. I mentally kicked myself for the unimaginative alias I for some reason felt I needed to say, but she didn't seem to mind. She took my hand, her grip firm and warm. Nice to officially meet you, Adam Smith, she said with a chuckle. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. So, what brings you to our quaint little diner 2 nights in a row? I chuckled, releasing her hand reluctantly. Well, the food is good, the atmosphere is cozy, and there's always a beautiful woman ready to take my order. What's not to love? She blushed, a faint pink spreading across her cheeks. I like your flattery, Mr. Smith. But, what can I get for you tonight? I already knew what I wanted. How about the same as yesterday? And a black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead. She nodded. Coming right up. And for the record, our coffee is strong, but I don't think it can perform miracles. Well, that's a shame, I said with a mock sigh. I was hoping for a bit of resurrection to go with my meal. She laughed again, a sound I was quickly becoming addicted to. I'll see what I can do, she said, turning to leave. As she walked away, I couldn't help but watch her, my mind racing with thoughts and emotions I hadn't felt in centuries. Evelyn Russo was a breath of fresh air in my otherwise stale life, and I found myself looking forward to our banter more than I'd anticipated. Minutes later, she returned with my coffee, placing it in front of me. Here you go, one resurrection special, she said with a wink. I took a sip, savoring the bitter warmth. Perfect, just what I needed. So, Evelyn, what's your story? How did you end up in this charming little diner? She took on a thoughtful smirk, her eyes alight. Oh, you know, the usual. Grew up in a small town, moved to the city for college, and found myself working here to pay the bills. It's not glamorous, but it pays the rent. Nodded, appreciating her honesty. Well, sometimes the best stories start in the most unexpected places. She smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. Maybe. What about you, Adam? What's your story? You don't seem like the typical diner regular. I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. Let's just say I've been around for a while. Seen a lot, done a lot. Now I'm just looking for a bit of peace and quiet. She looked at me, her eyes searching. You seem like you've got a lot of stories to tell. I shrugged, taking another sip of my coffee. Maybe one day I'll tell you some of them. Her smile returned, brighter than before. I'll hold you to that. Now, let me go check on your food. As she walked away, I felt a strange sense of contentment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged somewhere, even if just for a fleeting moment. Evelyn Russo was a mystery I was eager to unravel, and I had all the time in the world to do it. When she returned with my plate, I couldn't help but tease her. You know, if this food is as good as last night's, I might just make this a regular thing. She placed the plate in front of me, her eyes twinkling with amusement. Well, in that case, I'll have to make sure it's perfect every time. Taking a big bite and savoring the flavors. Yep, definitely perfect, I said with a grin. She laughed, shaking her head. You're something else, Adam Smith. Evelyn said with a smile and a laugh. Likewise, Evelyn Russo, I replied. The rest of the evening passed in a delightful blur of witty exchanges and stolen glances. Evelyn floated between tables, attending to other patrons, but always finding a moment to check in on me with a smile or a quick comment. Her laughter was like a melody that filled the room, and I found myself laughing along. As she cleared away my empty plate, she leaned in conspiratorially. So, Mr. Smith, did our humble diner meet your expectations again? I nodded, leaning back in my chair with a contented sigh. More than met, Evelyn. You and your pie have officially won me over. She chuckled, shaking her head. Well, I'm glad to hear it. Maybe next time you'll try something other than pie, though. Maybe, I said, though in truth, I was more interested in the company than the food. But you have to promise me you'll be here. Evelyn's eyes sparkled with amusement. Oh, I'll be here. My shifts are pretty regular. Same time tomorrow. I felt a warmth spread through me at the thought. Same time tomorrow, I agreed. As she moved away to attend to another table, I couldn't help but watch her, a mixture of admiration and longing in my gaze. Despite my centuries of existence, the human heart within me still beat with yearning, and Evelyn had sparked something I thought long dormant, the want for someone closer than I had ever let anyone else be. The night wore on, and eventually, it was time for me to leave. I stood up, straightening my suit jacket, and made my way to the counter to pay. Evelyn was there, her radiant smile greeting me once more. Leaving so soon? She asked, a hint of disappointment in her voice. Unfortunately, duty calls, I said with a rueful smile. But I'll be back, I said in a thick German accent. She handed me my change, her fingers lingering just a moment longer than necessary. I'll hold you to that, Adam Smith. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Excitement, anticipation, and a touch of fear. Fear of getting too close, of letting someone in, only to lose them. But as I walked down the street, the image of Evelyn's smile stayed with me, and I knew I couldn't stay away. The following night, I found myself at the diner once more, greeted by the familiar warmth and chatter. Evelyn was there, just as she promised, and our banter picked up right where we left off. Each night, we learned a little more about each other, her aspirations, my carefully crafted tales of a life lived. Yet, amidst the laughter and shared stories, there was always a part of me that held back. How could I explain my true nature to this vibrant, mortal woman? How could I let her in, knowing that one day, I would have to watch her grow old and fade away while I remained unchanged? A part of me realized why it was hard for Edward to commit to Bella. He didn't want to change her into what he thought of as a monster, and he didn't want to watch what he loved slowly age then fade. But for now, I pushed those thoughts aside, choosing to savor each moment with Evelyn. She was a bright spot for me in a world that had lost its luster, and I wasn't ready to let go. One evening, as the night grew late and the diner began to empty, Evelyn sat down across from me during a rare lull. You know, Adam, you never seem to talk much about your family. Do you have any? I hesitated. I have friends who are like family, I said carefully. But no blood relations. She tilted her head, her eyes searching mine. That must be lonely. I shrugged, trying to brush it off. I've gotten used to it. Besides, I have good friends, and now, I have this place. Her smile was soft, understanding. Well, I'm glad you found us. And for what it's worth, I'm glad you're here. As the days turned into weeks, our connection deepened. Despite my fears, I found myself drawn to her more and more each day. Evelyn had become a beacon of light in my world, and I couldn't imagine my nights without her laughter and warmth. But as much as I cherished our time together, the reality of our differences loomed ever larger. I knew the day would come when I would have to make a choice, to reveal the truth to her or to walk away to protect myself. Until then, I chose to live in the moment, to enjoy the simple joy of her company and the thrill of our growing bond. Evelyn Russo had brought a new kind of sparkle into my life, and for that, I was grateful. Please let me know how the progression between Adam and Evelyn is going. I've never written romance, so please let me know. I don't want it to be too rushed or like a vampire's bond, but instead a natural bond that forms over time. 2,544 words. Time for that talk. Over the past few weeks, our lives had taken on a sort of rhythm. In the morning, I would have breakfast cooked by Esme, who seemed to find great joy in the simple task. Then from there, we would spend the days chatting, or going out for errands. I figured why not, and bought myself a car to get around, and a good number of suits. In the evening, Carlisle and Esme would go out for a hunt, while I went out to the diner to see Evelyn. After returning home, I would meet up with Carlisle and Esme. Carlisle would normally be getting ready for the night shift at the hospital. This night was no different. I was laying on my bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the night over in my head. Then I heard someone knock on the front door. My eyes popped open. Since I had been here, there had only been one person to knock on the door before, and that was the girl from the front desk. And I didn't have anything planned to be delivered this time. I sprang to my feet, happy I had yet to fully undress for the night. So, with my fancy white shirt slightly disheveled, and my black tight-fitting pants still held up with suspenders, I made my way towards the front door, while shuffling along in light pink slippers. Reaching the door, I was greeted with both Carlisle, who was in his usual outfit he wore as a doctor, and Esme, who was in a knee-length dress, both fighting over the peephole. Are you two gonna keep fighting over quick glances through that, or just open the door? I asked lightheartedly, knowing from their reactions who it was behind the door. They both looked at me at vampiric speed, then at each other. Opening the door, Carlyle smiled at the young man who stood on the other side. Edward, it's good to see you. Carlyle said, his emotions clear to hear. Jostling Carlyle to the side, Esme stepped forward where Carlyle had been standing. She didn't say anything, and neither did Edward. I'm sure his shrewd words played through his mind as they embraced from the last time we spoke. Edward looked drawn and tired. His eyes were dark brown, clear that hadn't fed in some time. Separating, Esme looked up at Edward, her eyes full of love and kindness. It's good to see you again. Esme said, her grip tightening on Edward's arms as she looked him over. It is good to see you as well, Esme, Carlyle. Edward sighed, looking at both of them as he said their names. Then, turning his head, he saw me. I stood just behind Esme and Carlyle, my hands in my pockets. So, you decided to come and talk? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Edward's eyes flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and vulnerability as he met mine. The silence between us was heavy, laden with unspoken words and unaddressed words. The weight of our last encounter pressed down on us like an invisible shroud, but I could sense the flicker of resolve in his gaze. Yes, Edward finally replied, his voice a mere whisper, barely audible. I've thought about what you said, Adam. About facing my past. He paused, as if searching for the right words, his eyes momentarily drifting away before locking back onto mine with an intensity that could pierce through steel. I can't keep running. But I don't know if I will be able to stop. Esme's grip on Edward's arm softened, her touch tender and reassuring. You don't have to do this alone, Edward, she said warmly, her voice imbued with a maternal strength that seemed to envelop him. We are here for you, now and always. Carlyle nodded in agreement, his expression one of unwavering support while he placed a comforting hand on Edward's shoulder. We'll help you through this, son. Every step of the way. We went silent for a moment. I think it's time me and Edward go have the rest of that talk now. I said, clapping my hands together to dispel the air of emotion that was filling the entrance. Carlyle, you have work to get to as well. I said, raising one of my brows. Carlyle looked down at his wristwatch, then back at me. I can take the night off. I shook my head with a small chuckle. There's no need. This is a conversation just between me and Edward. He glanced at Edward, who subtly nodded his head. Carlyle nodded his head. Very well, he said, looking at Edward. Putting a hand on Edward's shoulder, Carlyle smiled at him. I hope you stay, Edward. But I will also understand if you feel that this kind of life isn't for you. Edward nodded his head. Thank you, Carlyle. Patting his shoulder, Carlyle started to make his way to the end of the hall and to the elevator. Turning away from Carlyle and back to look at us, Edward stood there awkwardly. Well, don't just stand there, come on in. Esme said, moving the conversation along. Stepping back, I let them walk by me, Edward staring at me as he passed. I couldn't read what it was I saw in his eyes. Maybe it was confusion. I'm going to get dressed, I said, turning to walk down the hall to my room. As I went, I listened to the conversation Esme and Edward were having. Esme didn't ask Edward about what he had been up to since he had left some 3 months ago. Instead, she talked about how good it was to have him back, and about how she had dusted his room every day. But like a rain cloud, Edward just had to rain on Esme's parade. I still haven't decided if I'm going to be staying here, he said, his voice neutral. Their conversation went silent. Moody little shit, I thought angrily as I put on looser fitting clothes that didn't cost close to $300. Throwing off my suit pants and suspenders, I put on a pair of worn-out Levi jeans and a pair of Converse. Converse were gym shoes at the moment, but I didn't care, they were much better than dress shoes. For a shirt, I wore a tan-colored sweatshirt. Stepping out and into the living room, I saw Edward standing by one of the windows along the wall, while Esme kept herself busy, doing menial tasks, like fluffing the couches, pillows, to straining up the decorations across the room. Ready to go? I asked Edward. He glanced at me. Where? He asked simply. Somewhere private. I said simply. He glanced at Esme, then stepped away from the window and towards the door. As he went, I turned to Esme and gave her a small smile, before I followed after Edward. The talk. Pulling off the main road, I pulled my black Mercedes-Benz 380 onto a dark back road surrounded by thick forests, some 40 minutes outside the city. Pulling off to the side of the road, I turned off the car. The whole ride up here not a word was spoken between me and Edward, just uncomfortable silence broken only by the soft notes of whatever was playing on the car's radio. All the way, Edward would take side glances at me, his thirst clearly evident in his darkened eyes. Opening my car door, I stepped out, taking in a deep breath of the fresh night air. Keeping my door open, I leaned down where I saw Edward still sitting, not moving a muscle. Are you gonna get out or just sit there as still as a corpse? I asked, smirking internally as he gave me one of his trademark scowls. That's the spirit, kid. I said cheekily as I closed my door. Walking to the front of the car, I waited as Edward opened his door and stepped out. Leaning my back against the front, I looked up at the night sky as Edward walked up beside me. Ready to go? I asked, turning my head to look at him. Where? He asked. I looked around us. We're in the woods, what do you think we're here for? I asked him, trying to press his buttons while I ignored the scowl he gave me. You might want to take that coat off. I said, pushing myself off the car. It looks expensive. He looked down at his long trench coat. I have spares. He said dryly. I shook my head. Would you take the damn thing off? I said sternly, like chiding a child. Most people try to preserve their expensive clothes and not get them bloody. I added, exasperated. Fine. Edward scoffed, taking the coat off with a sigh, draping it over the hood of my car. Happy? Edward asked. Ecstatic. I replied happily. Now, you should take the lead on this. I said, waiting on Edward. I would prefer to have this talk when you're not constantly being distracted by my blood. We ended up finding $2 in a small open clearing which were enough to quench Edward's thirst. Dragging the dead carcasses to the edge of the clearing, I walked back to its center where Edward was staring up at the night's clear sky. You know, this is one of my favorite views. I said, putting my hands in my pockets. He looked over at me. Why? He asked, no longer sounding like the dark cloud he had been before, but instead more relaxed now that he had something to quench his thirst that wasn't human. Because it never changes. I said simply. I know every time I look up, everything will always be where it has always been. No matter how much the world around me changes. We fell into silence after that. Neither saying anything as we looked up at the clear night sky. Are you really him? Edward asked, breaking the silence, but not looking away from the stars. I didn't say anything for a moment, instead, thinking about what I should tell him. I knew what he meant by that. And I knew I wasn't the actual Adam, created by God, but was instead a figure who became him through mistaken identity. No matter how much I tried to fight it, I preferred to let others come to their own conclusions about that, neither confirming nor denying it. That is until I can use it to my advantage. From what I could still remember and from what I wrote in my very personal diary, which I had written important information about the future in, Edward was once a pretty religious person like Carlyle, but had way more baggage to deal with of a different sort. Which is what started his whole, I no longer have a soul and am now a monster because I must drink blood to continue my existence which I don't want blah, dramatic. I looked over at Edward, coming to a decision. Yeah, I'm him. I said simply. I felt as the tension filled Edward at my words. Edward's eyes darted back to the stars, his brow furrowing as he processed my claim. I could tell he was teetering on the edge of skepticism and reluctant acceptance. The night seemed to hold its breath, waiting for my next move. I took a step closer to him, the cool night air wrapping around us like an embrace. But you need to understand something, I continued, my voice steady but laced with a hint of gravity. Being him doesn't mean I have all the answers. It doesn't mean I possess some divine wisdom or infallibility. I'm as flawed as anyone else. Edward turned slightly to face me, his intense gaze piercing through the darkness, searching for the truth in my words. Flawed. He echoed, a mixture of disbelief and curiosity painted across his features. You're supposed to be perfect. The first man, the benchmark for humanity. I chuckled lightly, shaking my head. That's the myth, isn't it? Perfection is an illusion. Every legend is built on a foundation of exaggerations and misconceptions. Just like you. You think you're a monster because of what you've become, but you're more than just your thirst for blood. You're capable of so much more. He remained silent for a moment, the weight of my words lingering in the air. The stars above twinkled like distant promises, and I could feel the tension in his body slowly begin to ease. You really believe that? He finally asked, his voice softer now, almost vulnerable. Of course I do, I replied, stepping back to give him space. Look at the choices you've already made. You could have succumbed to your instincts and thirst for human blood long ago, but instead, you choose to fight against that for some time. You strive to protect those who are innocent from those who wish them harm, even when it puts you at odds with your own inner turmoil. I said. And what of you? If you are who you say you are, then you should know the burden of expectation. Like the ones Carlyle and Esme have for me. Being Adam means you're constantly scrutinized, judged against an impossible standard. Carlyle and Esme have not once held you to a standard, Edward, I said, my voice stern. They know holding you to that ideal would only suffocate you. They love you for who you are, not for some mythical image. You need to let that sink in, I said, nodding emphatically. And that's why I refuse to let it define me. I've seen what happens when someone tries to live up to ideals. They lose themselves in the process. They forget that it's okay to be imperfect, to embrace the chaos of existence. It's not about being perfect, it's about being real. Edward turned to me, a glimmer in his eyes. So, you're saying I should embrace my monster? He asked quietly. Embrace every part of you, Edward. I replied. The monster, the protector, the man you once were, and the man you're becoming. They're all pieces of the same puzzle. You don't need to choose one over the other. Instead, learn to coexist with them. As the words left my lips, I felt an electric tension in the air, a shift in the atmosphere that suggested something profound was taking root between us. Edward stood there, contemplating the weight of my advice, and I could almost see the gears turning in his mind. You make it sound so simple, he finally said, a hint of sarcastic amusement creeping into his voice. As if I can just flip a switch and suddenly become the embodiment of acceptance. It's never simple, I scoffed. And it's certainly not instantaneous. It's a journey, one filled with trials and tribulations. But I believe in your ability to navigate it. Just look at how far you've come so far. It must have been torture for you to keep yourself from hunting another person, I said, a small smile creeping onto my face. I bet you did go on a few, but couldn't bring yourself to drink their blood. Instead, you incapacitated them. Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, a mix of embarrassment and defensiveness flashing across his face. You have no idea, he replied, his voice low and strained. It's not just about the blood. It's the guilt, the constant battle between what I am and what I wish I could be. The moments I've lost myself in the hunt, in the thrill of the chase, it's like being caught in a storm, oscillating between clarity and chaos. I nodded, understanding the depth of his struggle. That storm, Edward, it's a part of you. But it doesn't have to define your existence. Remember, even the fiercest storms eventually give way to clear skies. It's the calm that follows where we find ourselves, where we can reflect and grow. He turned back to the stars, his expression softening as he contemplated my words. You make it sound almost poetic, he said, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. But poetry doesn't change the reality of what I am. I'm still a vampire, still a creature of the night. True, I responded, stepping closer to him. But you're also a person, a being capable of love, compassion, and incredible strength. Your thirst for blood is just one aspect of your existence, not the entirety of it. The choices you make, the relationships you nurture, those are what truly define you. He sighed heavily, the weight of his internal conflict etched into every line of his face. Sometimes I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between the man I was and the monster everyone thinks I am. One wrong move, and I could fall into darkness. Then don't move, I said firmly, meeting his gaze with intensity. Stand still for a moment. Embrace the uncertainty. Accept that it's okay to feel lost sometimes. It's part of the human experience, even for someone like you. Especially for someone like me. Edward's expression softened further, and I could see the flicker of hope igniting within him. You really believe I can find that balance? He asked, searching my eyes for reassurance. I do, I affirmed, feeling a swell of conviction. You're already on the path. Acknowledging your fears and insecurities is the first step toward true acceptance. You've faced countless challenges, and yet here you are, still standing, still fighting. That's more than most can say. Rose and Trillionaire. Edward finally moved back in with Esme and Carlyle. To say they were happy would be the greatest understatement of the century. For the next few months and into 1934, I worked with Edward on his control over his thirst, which at the moment was at an all-time high, like an alcoholic cutting themselves off, cold turkey. I had to go with him everywhere he went every night, which really made it impossible for me to do anything I wanted. Like going to the diner or shopping. Thankfully, Edward was starting to last longer on the animal blood, no longer needing to go hunting every night. So today I decided to have a day for myself. Leaving early in the morning, I headed over to the Gringotts Bank here in New York City for some cash. Pulling into an open space a block away from the bank, I stepped out, straightening my expensive suit jacket. Leaning down, I checked my hair in the side mirror of my car. At the moment, my hair was short, almost a buzz cut on the sides, while on the top I left it quite long so I could slick it back. Standing back up, I started to make my way to the large building. Turning a corner, my bank came into sight. Gringotts Bank stood proudly at the corner of 5th Avenue and 42nd Street, an imposing edifice of marble and granite that took up 2 whole blocks. Its facade was a testament to its ancient origins, with intricate carvings depicting scenes from history and mythology, each telling a story of wealth and power accumulated over millennia. The grand entrance was framed by imposing Corinthian columns, each one etched with a history of its own. As I approached, 2 guards in Black Legion armor opened full glass doors. Giving them both smirks of appreciation, I walked in. I told you, Julius. Their armor is timeless, I thought as I stepped through the large doors. The lobby was a cavernous space, illuminated by enormous crystal chandeliers that hung from a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of prosperity and fortune 4 stories up. The floor was a mosaic of polished marble, and intricate patterns. Reaching into my suit's inner pocket, I pulled out my checkbook. Not wanting to make a scene for a simple cash withdrawal, I left the gold card in my wallet and instead walked over to one of the lines and waited while I started to write out the check for $1,000. As I did so, a stream of light came through the front doors as they opened behind me, catching my attention. Capping my pen, I turned my head curiously. As I watched, a pretty blonde woman came through the door. She wore an expensive-looking white dress, with one of those wide-brim hats perched at an angle on her head which matched her dress. It wasn't until she walked past me when I realized she was holding a woven basket people took to picnics. Just as she passed, my eyes flicked up just in time to see as her eyes turned in my direction, a glint of interest in her dark brown eyes. Not knowing what else to do, I smiled. She averted her eyes quickly, a small smile creasing her face. I couldn't seem to pull my eyes away as she went by. Stepping forward in the line, I watched as a well-dressed man walked through the many desks placed behind the teller's desks to meet the woman, quickly followed by a younger-looking man, also in a suit. The older man seemed to be the father of the young woman, while the second, younger-looking man, seemed to be one of his subordinates. Mom sent me to bring your lunch, the young woman said, handing over the woman basket to her father. Thank you, dear. I was in such a rush this morning I forgot to grab it on my way out. The woman's father said with a chuckle, taking the basket from her. Rose, I would like to introduce you to one of our new loan officers, Royce King. His father is the bank's vice president. The woman, Rose's father said, taking a step to the side to let them shake hands. But I had already stopped listening as my brain did a mental flip. Rosalie fucking Hale. Good evening, sir. The female teller said as I mindlessly stepped forward. Slapping the check on the desk, I asked for a withdrawal as I turned my head back to look at Rosalie, who was shaking the younger man's hand. And here you are, sir, $1,000. The teller said, counting out the bills in front of me. Thanks, I said, sliding the stack of bills from the counter, shoving them in my pocket. Stepping out of line, I turned my head in the direction of Rosalie who seemed to be standing awfully close to that Royce fella. Seems I'm gonna need to have my journal sent over, I thought as I struggled to remember her story. Which seemed to be something becoming all too common. Over the past few years, it had become harder for me to remember the story of this world. Driving back to Carlisle apartment, my day's plans dashed, I stepped through the door, only to be greeted by 4 large boxes stacked along the entrance wall. Looking down, I saw an envelope laying on top of one of the boxes with my name written in elegant handwriting. Seeing the familiar writing, I bent down and tore the envelope open. This year's income sheets of all your businesses. You're welcome, Julius. Shit, I said, realizing Carlisle had told Julius where I was. What are all of those? Edward asked, stepping into the hallway. Looking up, I shoved the letter into the envelope. Just some paperwork from work, I said simply, leaning down to take the lid off one of the boxes, looking for a certain red folder. Work? Edward asked, curiosity filling his voice. Yeah, remember how I told you I owned a couple of businesses all over the world? I said, opening the next few boxes until I found the red folder, ignoring all the other vanilla folders which filled the boxes. Yes. But you just mentioned it in passing. Edward sighed as I flipped open the red folder. Oh, would you look at that? I said in a fake astonished voice. What is it? Edward asked, taking a step forward. I looked up from the folder and gave him a smirk. We're in the black again. That's nearly 2,000 years in a row. I said with a chuckle as I handed Edward the red folder as I stepped by him to head to the kitchen. Stepping in, I saw Esme seated at the kitchen table drawing house designs on a large piece of paper. Grabbing a glass from one of the cupboards, I filled it with water from the tap as Edward stepped in after me, looking through the red folder, his eyes nearly popping out. Adam, dear, what do you think of this design? Esme asked, holding up the large piece of paper. Stepping closer, I looked it over. The design was captivating, a blend of modern aesthetics with classic architectural elements that Esme had always been passionate about. The lines were fluid, the spaces inviting, and I could easily envision how light would dance through the expansive windows she had drawn in. It's stunning, Esme, I said, genuinely impressed. You've managed to integrate the natural surroundings beautifully with the interior layout. It feels like a sanctuary. Her eyes sparkled with pride, as she set the sheet back onto the table. Turning, I saw Edward flipping one of the pages in the folder, his mouth agape. Don't hurt yourself there, kid. I said with a chuckle as I took a sip of my drink. Edward's head shot up, his eyes still wide. Adam, you said you owned a few businesses all over the world. Not every significant business in the world. Edward sighed, flipping back to the first page in the folder. Some were the companies you own are Coca-Cola, Standard Oil, General Electric, Ford Motor Company, and, wait, is this right? You also own Gringotts, the world's oldest and largest banking franchise, including their massive fleet of trading ships. Edward's voice wavered in disbelief as he continued to read off the list of assets. Adam, you're a trillionaire. This is insane. I couldn't help but chuckle at Edward's reaction. Well, I did say I owned a few businesses, I replied nonchalantly, leaning back against the kitchen counter. I just didn't specify how many or which ones. Turn to the last page, it has a list of all the businesses I own and my worth. I watched with a smirk as Edward flipped through the pages until he reached the last page, and he nearly dropped the folder. T3 trillion, he shouted, his eyes shooting up to mine. I didn't know there was that much money in the entire world. I shrugged. That's because there isn't that much money in the world. I said, setting my glass on the counter. That's how much everything I own is worth. Investments, properties, and an incredible amount of gold currency. With this level of wealth and influence, Adam, you could shape the world. You could do so much good with it. Or so much harm, I interjected, my tone suddenly serious. Power and wealth can corrupt, Edward. That's why I keep a low profile and use my resources carefully. I've seen what happens when people get drunk on power. It's not pretty. Esme nodded thoughtfully. You're right, Adam. It's a great responsibility. But I believe you can use it wisely. Edward seemed to recover from his shock, a thoughtful expression on his face. Well, it certainly explains a lot. You practically have more money than the entire world. Multiple times over. Esme glanced at her watch, then back at me. Adam, if you're free this afternoon, I'd love to get your opinion on a few more designs. I'm working on a new project, and your input would be invaluable, she said, abruptly changing the topic. Of course, Esme, I replied warmly. I'd be happy to help. All I have planned now is to send off a letter to England, then I'm free for the rest of the day. As the afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen, I felt a deep sense of contentment. Despite the complexities of my existence and the weight of my responsibilities, moments like these reminded me of what truly mattered. Family, love, and the bonds that held us together. From high to low. Closing the door behind me, I hummed a light tune which was fast-paced and upbeat. Dropping my keys into a small dish next to the door, I took off my jacket and hung it up, never stopping my humming. Someone seems to be in a good mood. Carlyle's curious voice said from behind me. I smirked, turning to face him. That's because I am in a good mood, Carlyle. I said, my smile never leaving my face. Carlyle only raised a brow questioningly as I smirked. I looked down, a nervous chuckle leaving my lips. There's this girl. I managed to get out before the sound of a book hitting the ground registered in my ears, as well as the startled gasp from Esme, who was seated in the living room. A girl? Carlyle asked, surprise written across his face. Yeah, I said, just as Esme's blurred form shot past Carlyle, stopping just in front of me. What's her name? Esme asked excitedly, her hands clasped together. I chuckled at her reaction. Her name is Evelyn Russo. She's a waitress at Dino's Diner close to the docks in Manhattan. I said, slipping off my shoes. Oh, a waitress. Esme said happily, her eyes sparkling. Evelyn's job not even a thought in her head as she thought about a possible love interest in my life. I nodded my head. Damn it. I heard Carlyle mumble under his breath as he looked down at the ground. I turned my head in his direction. Sorry. I asked, more surprised than angry. He looked up at me startled. What was that? Carlyle asked, playing the fool. You just said damn it, why? I asked, narrowing my eyes at him. Carlyle blinked at me a few times, panic causing him to fidget uncontrollably. I turned my head to the side slightly, showing I wasn't letting the issue go so easily. Carlyle coughed into his fist before speaking haltingly. Well, you see, me and Julius may or may not have had a small bet. I sputtered in surprise, both eyebrows shooting up to my hairline. What? I asked. Carlyle chuckled nervously. What was the bet? I asked. Well, it's been a bit of a running joke between us. Carlyle said, a small smile spreading across his face. I rolled my hand for him to go on. It was a bet set for if you would ever have a partner at all, or, if they would be male or female. My eyes went wide, a gleam of anger flashing in them. But before I could speak, Carlyle cut me off. Julius put his beachside estate in Monaco on the line, while I put my estate in Vigo, Spain on the line. Carlyle. Esme gasped out, whipping around to give her mate a stern glare. He raised his hands in surrender, clearly expecting the chitting he was about to get from Esme. But before she could start in on him, I cut in playfully. Dramatically, I raised my hands to my heart. Carlyle. You wound me. I gasped, falling to my knees, my face a mask of overdramatic grief. He gave me a glare over Esme's shoulder as she started to chide him. I couldn't help but give him a wicked smile, knowing he would be getting it far worse from Esme than I could dish out to him. Later that night, I stepped out of my room for a drink. But as soon as I stepped out, I could hear Carlyle call to me from his office room. Turning, I changed directions and stepped into his office. Seated behind an ornate wooden desk, Carlyle, his hands stapled together in front of himself as he gave me a small smile. Walking over to his desk, I took a seat in the plush leather chair in front of his desk, not saying anything, and instead giving him a raised brow of anticipation. Carlyle let out a small sigh. I would like to apologize for earlier. He said, making sure his voice was loud enough that Esme, who was currently in the living room, could hear his words. I smirked at him, waiting for more. He looked away before continuing. It was quite childish of me to participate in that bet with Julius and Jane. He said, finally looking me in the eyes. Jane was also a part of it. I asked, surprised Jane would even take part. Carlyle shrugged. If it makes it any better, she won the bet. He said, knitting his brows together. Really? I asked, surprised once again. He nodded. She bet you would find a female partner. Carlyle said sheepishly. I paused for a moment, my brain grinding all the new information. What did you bet? I asked curiously. He bit his lower lip. I bet that you would stay single. He said, looking at the wall so as to not look me in the eyes. And let me guess, I said, sitting forward in the chair. Julius bet I would have a partner, but it would be male. I asked, already knowing the answer. Carlyle smiled sheepishly again with a shrug. My face deadpanned. It was all in good fun, Adam, Carlyle chuckled. We have nothing but time in our hands, it's good to have a little fun every now and again. If I remember correctly, those tend to be your favorite fallback every time you play one of your pranks. Carlyle said, a chuckle escaping his lips. I rolled my eyes, he had a point after all. After a few seconds of silence, I couldn't help but break out in a fit of laughter, quickly followed by Carlyle. All right, I said, whipping a tear from the corner of my eye. Sitting in comfortable silence again, Carlyle leaned forward in his own chair, his voice now serious. I just have a question, though, he said, his eyes now sharp. I raised a brow, curious as to what he wanted to know. Do you think you can handle it? He asked. I tilted my head to the side slightly. What do you mean? I asked. He looked uncomfortable for a moment. Well, Adam, she's mortal. What happens if you fall in love with her or something of the like? He asked, his meaning clear. His words surprised me, then I felt like I had just been hit by a truck. Shit. I breathed out. The thought of her mortal existence was something that never seemed to enter my mind. And from what I remember from Julius and your journals, you didn't take the loss of your two sons too well. he said, his eyes now darting around the room, knowing he was walking on thin ice. The room became tense as any emotion seemed to slip from my face, a mask to hide the bits of grief which still remained. I only say this, Adam, because if you fall in love with this woman and she stays mortal, could your heart handle it? He asked, his eyes now meeting mine with resolve. I tapped a finger on my chair a few times as I settled my inner turmoil. Stopping my tapping, I spoke. In all honesty, that never came to mind when I was with her. I said thoughtfully. Carlyle nodded his head in understanding. I know how you feel, Adam. He said, looking to a wall full of books. When I first met Esme, she was just a young girl. But over the years as she grew older, a bond began to form. One I never expected to feel for another human, he said, leaning back in his chair and looking back to me. But nonetheless, it did. Then one day, I found out she had gotten married. His voice took on a sad tone, one of heartbreak and despair. It was an arranged marriage, one she didn't want. But you know how life was then. He said, his voice becoming stern. She ended up having a miscarriage. It destroyed her, Adam. The only possible hope in her life, died. He said sadly. It was only by sheer luck I caught word of what happened. When I did, I went out in search of her. I managed to follow her scent from her home. I found her barely hanging on to life at the bottom of a 5-story cliff. I sat in silence as Carlyle told me her story, a story I had not known before. It was out of selfishness that I changed her, and hope. Selfishness that the bond between us still existed, and I could finally find someone to love. And hope that she wouldn't hate me for what I had to do to fulfill my selfishness. We sat in silence for a moment, before Carlyle continued. I tell you this, Adam, because I don't want you to feel the loss I did in that moment when I found Esme. Carlyle inhaled sharply. Or maybe you do know that feeling, when you lost your sons. But there is this different feeling when it's someone you love like you couldn't love anything else in this world. He said, his eyes seeming to dig into my soul as he finished talking. The needed information. I ended up not going to the diner for a few days. Instead, I stayed with Edward, helping him with his control some more. Thankfully, a week and a half after I had sent the letter to my bank in England, my personal journal arrived here in New York at my New York bank. Getting the journal was as simple as placing a call on a private line to the bank's president, asking for it to be delivered. And delivered it was, in an armored truck and 10 of Gringotts guards. To say it was a bit of a shock for the residents of the building we lived on would be less than accurate. Opening the front door, Esme knew immediately who they were there for. Coming to the door after she had called for me, I myself was surprised to see the long hallway filled with men in black suits and purple ties. Hi. I said, looking at all the faces. Stepping forward, a very familiar face came into my view. It was none other than Rosalie's father. Good afternoon, sir. He said, bowing his head slightly, a respectful tone in his voice, with a splash of reverence. I am Joseph Hale, the bank's head accountant. I have been tasked in bringing you a package as well as a letter. He said, lifting a briefcase that was literally shackled to his right wrist. I looked at the cuffs, raising a brow at the spectacle. Very well. I said, nodding my head. Turning to another man, Joseph nodded his head. Taking a key from around his neck, the man handed it over to Joseph. Unlocking the case, Joseph very carefully pulled out a large package wrapped in cardboard paper and tied together with twine. Placed between the twine and the package was a thick letter. Gently taking the package, I looked at the letter, unable to place the handwriting. Looking back up at Mr. Hale and the rest of the men behind him, I didn't know what to do, so I just went with my gut reaction. Thank you all for giving me this very important package. I will be sure to tell your bosses how well this was delivered. I said with a wide smile, before closing the door slowly. Locking the door, I looked down at the package. What is that, Adam? Esme asked, standing just off to my side. Not wanting her to become too curious about the package, I looked up at her and smiled. Just some old papers I want to go over. Nothing too important, I said, slipping the envelope out from under the twine knot. Putting the wrapped journal under my arm, I ripped the seal open, pulling out the pristine paper from within. Bank Head of England. Geoffrey Montgomery Grimsby. To Mr. Godas. I have securely sent the item which was locked within your vault on the lowest level of our bank. The item has not been opened or tampered with, as I supervised its securement myself, as well as packaging. The package was also shipped under the protection of 3 guards and the bank's vice president on one of the bank's own cargo ships. Your ever loyal servant, Geoffrey Montgomery Grimsby. I refolded the letter quickly, shoving it back into the envelope. Certainly one way to end a message, I thought, shaking my head. Closing my room's door behind me, I set the package on the desk I had placed in my room, before pulling out the chair and sitting. Untying the knot, I pulled the cardboard paper off to reveal the worn-out cover of the journal. The cover was made from deer hide, and had clearly seen better days. Deep scarring covered it with numerous stains of age. Slowly opening the front, the sound of popping came from it, quite a few flakes falling onto my desk. The pages were a dark yellowish color, and were as dry as bark. It didn't take me long to realize that this journal was on the brink of turning into a pile of dust in my hands. So with extra care, I slowly started to turn the pages, passing pages of businesses I could invest in, certain historical moments I remembered at the time, and much more. Making it to the last quarter of the journal, I started to get into the Twilight characters. Each page held their names, discretions, and anything I knew about their background and how or why they were changed. Flipping through the pages, I finally made it to the one I sought. Rosalie Hale. Known for her striking beauty, which is often described as ethereal and captivating. Rosalie has long, golden blonde hair, a statuesque figure, and is often compared to a goddess in her appearance. Despite her stunning looks, Rosalie has a complex personality. She is fiercely protective of her family and has a strong sense of pride. Rosalie initially struggles with her vampire nature and her longing for a human life, particularly the desire to be a mother. Throughout the series, she shows a mix of strength, vulnerability, and loyalty. Her backstory involves a tragic history of being turned into a vampire against her will, which contributes to her characteristics. Rosalie Hale died in the early 1930s. Exact date unknown. She was attacked and assaulted by a group of men, leaving her in a near-death state. In her dying moments, she was found by Carlisle Cullen, who was drawn to her by the smell of her blood. He decided to transform her into a vampire to save her life. This traumatic experience greatly influenced her and shaped her feelings about humanity, motherhood, and her vampire existence. Rosalie's transformation allowed her to survive, but it also left her with a strong resentment toward her vampire nature and a longing for the human experiences she lost, particularly the ability to have children. Shit, I thought, slowly sitting back in my chair, the creaking wood filling my room. Hey, Adam, Carlisle's voice said through my door. I'm going shopping. Would you like to join? He asked. Turning my head, I looked at my locked door. Yeah, that sounds good to me. I could use some fresh air myself. I said, sitting forward in my chair, gently closing the journal before putting it in my suitcase and locking it. Sliding the suitcase back under my bed, I stood up, checking my clothes. I was currently wearing dark blue jeans and a black woolen v-neck sweater, with no shirt underneath. Unusual for the time, yes, but too comfortable for me to really care what people thought. Putting on my first-gen Chuck Taylor Converse, I opened the door. I found Carlisle, talking to Esme in the living room, seeing if there was anything he needed to pick up while out. Stopping, I turned and walked to Edward's room, tapping a few times on his door. Yes, I heard Edward ask from within. Opening his door, I leaned my head into his room. Edward was sitting in his leather chair, a book in hand. Me and Carlisle are heading out for a little while. Is there anything you need while we are out? I asked, making sure to include him in our lives so we wouldn't start acting too much like an outcast than he already tends to do. Edward shook his head, bringing his book back up to continue reading. I'm well, thank you. He said. I looked at the title of the book. A Farewell to Arms. I decided I would leave him to his sad book. So, giving him a small smile, I closed his door and made my way back down the hallway, where I saw Carlisle talking to Esme. Ready to go? I asked, getting their attention. Yes, Carlisle said, giving Esme a quick kiss before heading towards the door. Attacked from the shadows. The night went well. Carlisle didn't buy anything and instead followed after me as I did. I didn't buy anything big, but instead, I bought cool little knickknacks that caught my eye. Like some marbles and a yo-yo. Ignoring the playful jabs Carlisle gave me for that, I continued buying stuff. The thing about Manhattan, especially at this point and time, was that the shopping district was thriving. Of course, even back then, I'm sure it still did, but if I remembered correctly, a lot of shopping had moved to the internet. Walking into the lobby of the large building we called home, I played with my new toys as we stepped into our private elevator. Do you know how much money I could have made if I came up with the idea to make these? I said, dropping the yo-yo then snapping it back and into my grip. Carlyle looked at me with a raised brow. Adam, you have trillions, do you really need more money? He asked. I shrugged. No, but could you imagine? I said with a chuckle as the elevator let out a soft ting as the doors to the elevator opened. Walking down the long hallway, I put the yo-yo back in my pocket and pulled out a slinky. Reaching the door, Carlyle opened it, stepping in first. They just stepped in. I will put him on now. Esme's voice said from the living room. Walking down the hallway of the apartment, I saw Esme setting down the handset, turning to look at us, her face panicked. What is it, love? Carlyle asked, stopping just inside the living room. It's Jane. Julius has been attacked, she said, clenching her hands together. Hearing those words, my playful mood vanished. Stepping past Carlyle, I walked straight to the phone, picking up the handset and putting it to my ear. Is Julius okay? I asked, my voice as hard as granite. Yes, he's okay. But it was a close call, Adam. What happened? I asked, turning to see Edward stepping out and into the living room. Probably alerted by the sounds of Esme's worried voice. We were out for a walk, then out of nowhere, 5 vampires appeared. They dropped down from the rooftops. Jane's voice was slightly rushed. They surprised us, catching us off guard. They went for Julius first, focusing their attack at him. He was only grazed a few times before reacting, killing them all quickly. How did they get so close without either of you noticing? I asked, my brows coming together in concern. We don't know for sure, but we think they were waiting for us. We would have heard them walking on roofing from a good distance away. I agreed with that. Though it might have been some time since they had been in a conflict with other vampires, they knew what they were doing. Letting out a small sigh, I transferred the handset to my other hand before continuing. Has Julius healed up? I asked, jotting down some words on a notepad that was placed by the phone. Yes. After the attack and taking care of the bodies, we went for a hunt. Good, I said, handing Carlyle the note. I'm going to be heading to England as soon as possible. Expect me in a week's time. Do you think that is necessary? Jane asked. Yes, I said simply. The fact that 5 vampires attacked you should be enough to concern you as well. Especially since I presume you had never seen these vampires before. I asked as I saw Carlyle reading the note. That is true and the reason I am calling. Julius thinks it might just be some coven that moved close to us and didn't want us close by. But the issue with that is that we don't hunt humans and hardly ever leave the castle anymore other than to hunt. So how could any coven that moved close by know we even existed before we learned of them first? That's what has me worried. Who else knows you are there in England other than me and the Volturi? Jane interrupted. Exactly, I said, but that's not to say it's them. There are other possibilities that could have led to this that we just don't know at the moment. Which is the reason I'm heading there. If it is the Volturi, I will want to be there. And if it is not? Jane asked. Then I still want to be there. I said, picking up Carlyle's voice as he talked through the phone in his office. If it's not the Volturi and as Julius thinks, it isn't the slightest inconvenience for me to be there. It's better to be safe than sorry. Thank you, Adam. Jane said, letting out a sigh, audible through the phone. The both of you are family, Jane. It's what we do for each other. I said. Also, where's Julius now? I asked. He's currently in his office talking to some of his contacts, looking into who these vampires might have been. Right. Well, I won't be leaving for a few more hours, so if you get any news, call back and let me know. I said before we hung up the calls. Turning, Edward was the first to speak. Who was that? He asked. I looked over at him. That was Jane. Did Carlyle ever tell you about her and Julius? I asked. Edward shook his head in the negative. Julius and Jane are very old friends of mine. Julius is like a brother to me, like Jane is a sister. I've known them for a bit over 2,000 years now. Edward's eyes grew slightly wider as he imagined living for so long. And as I'm sure you heard, they were attacked. I'm heading to London tomorrow to check things out. Make sure it wasn't anything other than a new coven moving close by. Do you think it's that simple? Esme asked as Carlyle walked back into the living room, done with the task I had given him. I shook my head. I highly doubt it. Things are never that simple. I have you booked on a ship to London. It departs first thing in the morning. Carlyle said, handing me a small piece of paper with the details written on it. Taking the paper, I looked it over and saw the ship would be departing at 9 in the morning tomorrow. Thank you, Carlyle. I said, folding the paper. As I did so, Edward's eyes narrowed slightly, his brow furrowing in that familiar expression of determination mixed with curiosity. I want to come with you, he said, voice firm and leaving little room for negotiation. I sighed, expecting this would happen, but still hoping he might be sensible enough to stay behind. Edward, it's not a good idea. We don't know what we're walking into. It could be dangerous, potentially more than you can handle. His arms folded across his chest, and he took a step closer, his resolve unwavering. That's exactly why I need to go. If there's danger, I can help. Esme, who had been listening quietly, placed a gentle hand on Edward's arm. Edward, Adam's right. We don't know what this is about. It might be safer for you to stay here. Edward shook his head, his determination only growing stronger. I understand the risks, but I'm not a child. I can handle myself, and I want to help. If this involves the Volturi or something worse, it's even more reason for me to be there. Carlyle looked between us, his gaze thoughtful. Adam, Edward has a point. His abilities might be useful. And if it does come down to ITI, having more allies at your back could be beneficial. I ran a hand through my hair, weighing the pros and cons. Edward was stubborn, and once he set his mind on something, there was little one could do to dissuade him. Besides, he was right, his talents could be an asset. Finally, I nodded, albeit reluctantly. Fine, you can come. But you follow my lead, and if I say it's too dangerous, you will be leaving. Understood. A flicker of relief crossed Edward's face, quickly replaced by a serious nod. Understood. Good, I said, watching as Edward left to start his packing. As Edward left the room to prepare, Carlyle approached me, his expression one of concern and support. Thank you for letting him come. He needs to get out more, especially with everything he's been going through lately. I nodded, understanding his words. Edward had been dealing with his own struggles, particularly that of his thirst for human blood and still coming to terms with what he now is and what he has done. London. So this is London, Edward sighed as we stood on the side of the ship, looking over the bustling harbor our ship was currently in the process of docking at. Quite the sight, no? I asked, leaning on the ship's railing, a cigar between my fingers. It's certainly different. Edward sighed, looking up at the gray sky. I turned to look at him, smirking. It's a sort of safe haven country for vampires, I said, standing up and looking around. It's cloudy or overcast most days, allowing vampires to live a somewhat better life out in the open than most other places on Earth. Brr. The ship's steam horn boomed. I looked around us. It looks like the ship is about to disembark. We should get a move on. I said, leaning down and grabbing my suitcase by my feet, while flicking the cigar over the side of the ship. Edward quickly followed my actions, grabbing his own suitcase as I started walking towards where the gangplank bridge was about to be put into place. Weaving through the large crowd with millennia of experience, I made it look easy as I moved through small gaps and opening in the swarm of people to reach the walkway quickly, Edward barely managing to stay close to me. Reaching the bottom of the staircase, I looked around. This way, I said, pointing my finger to our right, where the exit of the dockyard should be. Walking to our right, we made it to a busy road, full of black cabs and other cars, waiting for passengers. Looking around, I caught sight of a well-dressed man who was holding out a small white site with "Gotas" written in large black lettering. That must be our ride, I said, walking towards the man before I even finished speaking. As we got closer, I saw the car the man was standing in front of. It was a black and red Austin 7. It was a nice common car, easy to get around in. Walking up confidently, the man seemed to recognize me as he came to a sort of attention as I walked up. Good afternoon, sir, the young man said, placing the sign behind his back as he drew himself up. Good afternoon, I said in my American accent. I am William Green and will be your driver. May I get your luggage loaded, sirs? William asked, his English accent thick. Sure thing. Just be careful, I said, handing over my suitcase which must have weighed close to 50 pounds. The weight of the case surprised William as he grabbed hold to the handle, nearly dropping it as I let go of it. Oof. Looks like someone didn't pack light, William said with a laugh as he moved to the back of the car. Placing the suitcases in the trunk, or now that we are in England, boot, of the car, we headed out to Julius and Jane's castle. Edward sat in the back seats while I stayed up front and chatted with William. The whole ride, Edward couldn't keep his eyes away from the window as he absorbed all of the new sights he was seeing. It took us nearly 45 minutes to reach the castle, and I couldn't help but smile as it came into view. It hadn't changed in the slightest. It still towered over the surrounding building, and was still surrounded by the same massive stone wall. Is that a castle? Edward asked, leaning closer to the window. That it is, I said with a chuckle. Quite stereotypical of them, isn't it? I said with a chuckle, knowing he would get what I meant without me having to say it out loud in the car with William. I heard him grunt in the back seat in response. Pulling onto a gravel road, I saw that it led to a large metal gate, which was in the place of where the large oak and steel doors to the walls that circled the castle used to be. As we approached, two men in nice suits stepped out from beside the gate to stop us before we could get too close. Quickly winding his window down, William leaned his head out to talk with one of the guards. Good afternoon, sirs, he said cheerily to both severe-looking men. What's your business here? One of the guards asked, stepping up to the window and leaning down to get a look inside the car. We're here on behalf of Mr. Godas, William replied smoothly, handing over a small envelope. The guard took it, scrutinized the contents briefly, then nodded and stepped back. Proceed, he said, signaling to the other guard to open the gate. The massive metal structure creaked and groaned as it swung open, revealing the cobbled path leading to the imposing castle. As we drove through, I couldn't help but spot the bulges in their nice suit jackets. It seems Gringotts guards now carry guns. Damn it, Julius, damn you. Can you keep my guards the way I want them? I whined in my head silently. Passing through the gate and stone walls, I couldn't help but admire the sprawling grounds which hadn't changed in a few hundred years on the inside of the walls. The castle was surrounded by carefully manicured gardens, dotted with ancient oaks and guarded by statues that seemed to watch our every move. It was as if the place was frozen in time, untouched by the modern world beyond its walls. Edward, still peering out of the window, seemed captivated. This is incredible, he breathed, his eyes wide with awe. I nodded, understanding his amazement. Julius has always appreciated nature, I said. William brought the car to a gentle stop at the foot of the grand stone staircase leading to the castle's entrance. As we stepped out, the heavy wooden doors at the top of the stairs swung open, and a tall, elegant figure appeared at the threshold. His dark hair was cut to a medium length that just reached his shoulders, his eyes a mix of brown and gold. Ah, welcome, welcome. Julius's voice boomed across the courtyard as he descended the steps, arms outstretched in greeting. His presence was commanding, yet there was a warmth in his eyes that put one at ease. Julius, I said, extending my hand, which he clasped firmly before pulling me into a quick embrace. It's been far too long, he said, slapping my back hard a few times, which might have killed a normal man. Indeed, Julius replied, shifting his gaze to Edward. And you must be Edward. It is a true pleasure to finally meet you. He said, extended a hand, which Edward shook somewhat awkwardly, clearly still adjusting to the grandeur of his surroundings. I trust your journey was pleasant. Julius inquired as he gestured for us to follow him inside. Very much so, I replied, glancing at Edward, who nodded in agreement. Inside, the castle was a blend of the medieval and the modern, with ancient tapestries lining the walls and soft electric lamps casting a warm glow. The air was cool and carried a faint scent of lavender and old books. Julius led us through a series of grand halls which brought back old memories. Each room was more impressive than the last, until we finally arrived at the main sitting room. A fire was crackling in the fireplace, and plush armchairs were arranged invitingly around it. Please, make yourselves comfortable, Julius said, motioning toward the chairs. We have much to discuss. Lineage and a plan. Stepping into the cozy sitting room, I plopped down comfortably in one of the chairs, propping my feet up and onto the small wooden coffee table. Remove your feet before I remove them for you. A new yet familiar voice said coldly from the sitting room's entrance. Turning my head, I saw Jane walking into the room, a small smile playing on her lips. I grinned. Ah, Jane, it's been a while. I laughed, standing to my feet. That it has. Jane said, wrapping her arms around my torso in a hug. Patting her back, I couldn't help but smile. And all it took to get a hug from you is to be gone for 100 years or so. I laughed as Jane squeezed harder around my waist. Releasing me, Jane turned and looked at Edward, who was sitting in the middle of a fancy leather couch. And this is, Edward? Jane asked in a playful voice as she sauntered over to him, her hand outstretched. It is a pleasure. Edward sighed, standing quickly from his seat. That it is, Jane said, her eyes glinting mischievously. Then, Jane turned, pointing to a wall behind me. Turning myself, I saw a large woven tapestry taking up a whole of one side of the room. A smile came to my lips as I looked at the piece of art and history. Covering the entire tapestry were faces with names woven underneath. All the way at the very top was me, then under me was Gerard and Oliver, who branched off their own families. Looking all the way at the bottom, I saw what looked to be a new addition. From some research, we found that Edward is a direct descendant of Oliver's. Julius said, walking closer to the artwork. We had lost track of them from a false death certificate, when in reality it was mistaken identity. Someone had somehow gotten hold of Edward's great-grandfather's wallet and identification papers. Not long after which, he died a rather gruesome death. The body was unrecognizable and the identification papers were all they could go on. Turning to look at Edward, Julius smiled slightly. We had everyone from your grandparents to you added to the tapestry, Edward. Julius said, pointing to where a small image of Edward's likeness was added to the tapestry. Standing, Edward slowly walked towards the tapestry, his eyes moving from one face to another. Carlyle sent us photos of you and your family members. Jane added. Slowly, Edward's eyes reached the top, where I, Gerard and Oliver were. While he was busy taking in all of that, I turned to face Jane and Julius who were now standing by the couch. So what have you learned about the attack? I asked, walking back to my seat. As of yet, nothing. Julius said. We got in contact with some of the other coven leaders here in England, but they knew nothing of the attack or who was behind it. I nodded my head, figuring as much. We will go to the other covens tomorrow and ask again. I said, plopping down in the leather armchair while letting out a long sigh. Julius raised a brow at my words. But we have already asked them, Adam. Why again? He asked, confused and slightly perturbed. Well, last time you didn't have me or Edward. I said, giving him a hard stare. Edward can read minds. If the other coven leaders were lying, how would you know unless you were in their minds? I said, tapping my forehead. True. Most coven leaders here in England are no younger than 200 years old. They would have the ability to mask the fact that they are lying quite well. Jane said, looking at Julius with a small smile. I suppose we can go to the first few covens tomorrow. Julius said, looking into the fire in the fireplace. Good, I said, standing to my feet. Now, it has been a long trip, so I'm going to take a nap. I said, turning and leaving the large room. I left without another word, and Edward by himself. I figured they could have a good talk without me hanging around. Finding my old room, I took a nice long nap. Waking up, I saw that it was dark outside. Making my way back downstairs, I found Jane still in the sitting room, reading a large book. Good evening, I said through a yawn. Looking up from her book, Jane smiled at me. Good evening, Adam. How did you sleep? She asked as I looked at the fireplace. It was good, I said, walking over to the fireplace. Are they in the library? I asked. Yes. They went down about an hour ago. Jane said, picking her book back up to continue. I nodded, pulling the secret lever to open the entrance to my personal library. Stepping through, I listened as it closed behind me as I descended the stairs. Reaching the library, I found Edward seated at a large wooden table with one of my journals in front of him as he deciphered the words with a handful of word key sheets in his hands. Turning my head, I saw Julius reading one of my signed copies of Alexander Pope's, an essay on man. It's good to see the both of you bonding, I said as I stepped off the stairs, causing both to look up from their books. This is incredible, Adam, Edward sighed as he gestured at my journal in front of himself. To document so much from so long ago, it's amazing. He said, setting the old word key sheets down. Yeah, just be careful would ya? I said, walking closer to look at the journal. These things are old and haven't exactly been taken care of over the years. I said, rubbing my fingers over the cracked and worn pages. Of course. Julius told me as much. Edward sighed, going back to reading. Walking over to Julius, I took a seat in the leather chair next to Julius's S. So, who's going to be the first we meet tomorrow? I asked. Julius set down the book, and intertwined his fingers together. To start off, we should visit the Brando Coven. They are relatively new to England and have a total of 6 members. They came here from Portugal around 5 years ago. And have you ever met them in person? I asked. Julius nodded. There isn't a coven here in England I haven't met before. He said with a smile. Because unlike you, Adam, I actually try to become acquainted with other covens. I shrugged my shoulders. They just tend to annoy me, Julius. That's why I mostly try to leave them alone. It's the Victorian era ones who always annoy me. Julius said, surprising me. Turning to look at him, I raised a brow. They are just too pompous for my liking. he said, picking his book back up, causing me to laugh. Very well. We leave in the morning, I said, standing to my feet. Revealed. We ended up leaving just after dawn, going to see the closest coven, the Brando Coven, which were in the center of London, not even a mile from Buckingham Palace. Sitting in the driver's seat of Julius's 1930 Lagonda four-seater. Why am I in the passenger seat of my own car? Julius asked, turning his head to look at me, the wind swirling his hair around as we weaved through traffic. Because you drive like an old woman, I said playfully, pulling hard on the wheel to take a corner about 10 miles over the speed limit. Geez. Julius shouted as the back tires skidded across the concrete. Relax, would ya? I said as a laugh escaped my mouth. Hey, over there. Julius shouted, pointing to a large four-story brick home. Smashing the brake, the car came to a careening halt. Adam, if there is anything wrong with my car after this, you are buying me a new one. Julius scowled. Relax, dear. You know he's good for it. Jane said, a small smile gracing her face as she leaned forward in the back seat. Trillionaire. I heard Edward murmur from behind me. Right. I interjected. This their home? I asked, putting the car in park and pulling out the key. Yes, that's their home. There's 5 of them. We don't know if any of them have powers. Julius said, turning in his seat to look at the home. That's fine, I said, opening my car door and pulling the lever for the chair to move forward so Edward and Jane could get out. Vampires actually having powers is quite rare. Slamming the door shut, I adjusted my suit jacket before stepping onto the curb. Is there anything I should know about them? I asked as we approached the home. They were all turned in the Victorian era, Julius said, turning to look at me. His expression told me everything I needed to know about how he felt about them. Okay, I said, taking the few steps up until I was at the door. They know we are here. Edward whispered from the back of our group. They are confused as to why Jane and Julius are here, as well as who Adam and I are. How useful. I chuckled, knocking on their door. Just remember the plan, Edward. I said, turning to look at him. He nodded his head. Good. I said, just as the front door was opened to reveal a tall skinny man with shoulder-length brown hair and one of those weird curly mustaches. Good evening, sir. I said in my best upper-crust British accents, with a smarmy look on my face. Evening, the man said in a higher-pitched voice. If you would be so kind, we would like to ask you a few questions. I said, an insincere smile on my face. The man looked at me for a moment before looking past me at Julius and Jane. It would be in your best interest to spare some time for him. Jane said, her voice like honey as she spoke to the man. His blood-red eyes lingered on her for a moment before they shot back to look at me. Very well, he said, backing away from the door to let us in. I am most thankful, I said cheerily as I stepped through the door, quickly followed by Julius, Jane, and Edward. As I stepped in, I saw 4 others standing in the foyer. I ignored them and their reactions to me as I looked around their rather impressive home. I see all of you are still living in a bygone era. I said, changing my accent back to my more normal American. The other 4 vampires were 3 men and 1 woman. The men were all wearing more modern clothes while the woman wore a gray dress straight from the Victorian era. The 3 men all had longish hair and clean-shaven faces, all with brown hair, except for the woman who had blonde hair. It is what we are most comfortable with. The woman said, raising her chin to look down her nose at me. That I can understand. But you do know there was something called electricity that was invented quite some time ago. I believe it was on the rise in popularity when all of you were still human. Live how you like, but why make life harder on yourselves? I asked, turning to look at them. The woman raised an eyebrow at my comment, clearly unamused. We prefer tradition. After all, it is the essence of who we are, she retorted, her voice dripping with disdain. Tradition is a lovely thing, but it can also be a cage, I replied, glancing at Edward. He was already scanning the minds of the other vampires, his focus intense. I could tell he was searching for any hint of hostility or knowledge about the recent attack. The woman grimaced. Who are you to question how we live, human? The woman snarled, her fangs showing as she spoke. He's someone you really don't want to anger. Jane said behind me in a calm, level tone. The woman turned to look at Jane, the sneer still on her face, but was interrupted before she could speak. He's human. What could he possibly do to worry us? One of the other men standing by the woman asked, stepping forward. He wouldn't need to do anything, Julius chimed in. Me and my mate here would be enough to kill all of you before you had time to process the fact that your heads were removed from your bodies. But I suppose we might as well tell you, Julius said, crossing his arms over his chest. His name is Adam. He's the first man, Julius said, dropping my name like a nuke. The room went silent for a moment before the woman let out a loud laugh that echoed off the walls, shortly followed by the others. Adam, the first man. The woman said through fits of laughter. I turned to look at Julius. Can I do it my way now? I asked. He let out a sigh, looking at the group of vampires who were still laughing. Why not? He said with a shrug, exasperated. Grinning, I turned to the vampires who were looking at each other, wiping fake tears from their eyes. Time to do this the old-fashioned way. I said with a grin, the vampires not hearing my words. I disappeared with a snap, my movement so fast it displaced the air where I had stood. I appeared holding the woman by the throat and off the ground on the other end of the foyer. The laughter now gone from the room as Julius held the other vampires still with his telepathic ability. We could have done this the nice way. I said, squeezing hard on her throat as she looked down at me, panic now filling her eyes. But no, we had to do it this way. I said, my eyes growing colder with every second. I'm going to ask this once. And one time only. What do you know about the attack on Jane and Julius? I asked, my grip loosening just enough for her to answer. Nothing. She managed to get out through gritted teeth. Turning my head, I looked at Edward, whose eyes were narrowed as he focused on the woman. She knows something but is trying to cover whatever it is up with other thoughts. He said, looking at me. Turning, I looked at Jane, I spoke. Do your stuff. Maybe that'll help loosen her lips and thoughts. I said, turning the woman in my grip towards Jane. The woman must not have known what her powers were because she looked right into Jane's eyes as she said that magical words. Pain. Jane said, her voice now hard. In a millisecond, the woman started to scream and convulse as the fiery pain washed through her. Grabbing hold of the woman's hands to keep her from scratching me, I watched her twitch for a few moments before speaking again. All you have to do is tell us, and all of this can stop. I said loudly so all could hear me over her screams. Next time I have to ask, I'm going to start killing the members of your coven. I said, just as Jane released her from the pain. Speak. I yelled. But she remained silent. So be it. I said, not needing to turn as I heard the tearing of stony flesh, as Julius telepathically tore off one of the male vampire's heads. Pain. Jane again said, sending the woman into convulsions again. You don't even have to say it, just think of it, and we will know. I shouted as the woman screamed. No. She screamed. I got it, Adam. Edward Said, his eyes growing wide as he sorted through whatever the woman let slip in her mind. The woman stopped convulsing as Jane released her from her gaze. Turning to look at Edward, I raised a brow. What is it? I asked. It seems most of the covens here in England have banded together into a coalition of sorts to get rid of Jane and Julius. He said, turning to look at me. What? I exclaimed in astonishment. Something about how they will have free reign over the country since the Volturi don't come here. Edward Said, raising one of his brows. I couldn't stop the scoff that escaped my lips as I listened to his words. Turning to the woman, I shook her hard. How stupid are all of you? They are the reason the Volturi don't come here. I said, tightening my grip on the woman's neck. Kill them and guess who's coming, the Volturi, you numbskulls. I said, shaking my head as the woman snarled at me. Tuning to Edward, I spoke. Did you get all the covens involved? I asked. He slowly nodded. I think so. He said with a shrug. It doesn't matter. You probably got most of them, which should be enough to dissuade the ones you didn't get from ever trying something like this again. I said, slowly turning to look the woman in the eyes. Sorry about this. I said with a wide smile as I slowly started to add more pressure to my grip on her neck until cracks began to appear. Then, like a rock under a compressor, her head separated from her body, sending both clattering to the polished wooden floors. Glancing down at her body for a moment, I turned to Julius and nodded, giving him the go-ahead to kill the others, which he did with a lazy motion of one of his hands, twisting the heads off the other vampires. Looks like we are going to have a busy few days. I said, rubbing my hands together, removing the crystal dust left on my hands from the woman. Yes, but we should act against the other covens in one sweep, not giving them time to disperse. Jane said, stepping closer to Julius, grabbing hold of one of his free hands with her own. Yes. It should be early in the morning. After all of them are home after their night hunts. Julius added. I nodded. So tonight we plan, and tomorrow morning, we act. Going from one guilty coven to the next. I said, turning to look at Edward. How are you holding up, kid? I asked. He nodded, not seeming bothered by what he had just witnessed, but I knew how good he was at hiding his emotions, so I've made a mental note to ask again later. What do we do with the bodies? Edward asked, changing the subject away from himself. Definitely need to ask again later. I thought as I went along with his change in subject. We burn them. I said, turning to look into one of the large rooms connected to the foyer. The room I looked into was a large plush sitting room with a large fireplace that was lit. Me and you will put them into this fireplace. Julius and Jane, you two will put 3 of them in the basement furnace. I said, taking off my jacket and rolling up my sleeves. Later that night, after a long planning session with Julius and Jane where we planned tomorrow's activities, I decided to get some fresh air on one of the castle's balconies, to get some of the night's fresh air. As I closed the door behind me, I spotted Edward leaning against the stone wall of the balcony. Not saying anything, I leaned against the wall a few paces away from him. Long day? I asked, looking up at the cloudy sky, unable to see the stars. I heard the rustle of fabric as he shrugged. Yeah, he said simply. I turned to look at him. You know that what happened today won't be the last time? I asked. He nodded his head. I do. He said simply. I nodded. Good. I said, letting Edward deal with how he felt about killing other vampires on his own. I just wanted to make sure he wasn't falling back into his dark self again. I looked back out into the night, catching sight of the castle's chapel. Hey, you wanna see something? I asked, looking at Edward, who turned to look at me. Sure, he said, pushing himself off the wall. Smirking at him, I said, then follow me. Jumping over the wall, I plummeted 3 stories to the ground, rolling as I hit the bottom, jumping back onto my feet as I looked up at Edward, who was looking down at me from the balcony with a raised brow. You can do it. I yelled up to him dramatically as I gave him a thumbs up. Shaking his head, Edward disappeared from the balcony for a moment before I saw his blurred figure come shooting away from the balcony. There ya go. I said with a laugh as Edward hit the ground running. That's one way to do it. I said with a shake of my head. Walking towards me, Edward spoke. So where to now? He asked. This way. I said, turning towards the chapel. Reaching its old wooden door, I pulled on the metal hinge, opening the door with a slight tug. Stepping in, I saw it hadn't been changed since its creation so long ago. I've missed this place, I said as Edward closed the door behind him. This is what you wanted to show me? He asked, confused. I shook my head, walking down the middle of the church to the large stone altar. Stopping, I pointed to the carved engravings on the side of the altar. Read that out loud for me, would ya? I asked as Edward stopped beside me. In perpetuum unity, in perpetuum memorati, in perpetuum grae, he said, deciphering the words in his head. Forever united, forever remembered, forever grae. He said slowly. Do you know what this is? I asked, gently putting my hand on top of the smooth polished stone. He shook his head. This is the family crypt. I said, using the one hand I had on top to push the top to the side. It's time to meet your very great-grandparents. I said, dropping down and into the crypt. Hitting the bottom, I quickly moved to the side as Edward soon followed. Wafting my hand in front of me, I fanned the clouds of dust away from my face. It seems I have to do some cleaning down here. I said, turning to look at Edward, who was turning his head in all directions. Come on. I said, gesturing for him to follow. They are all the way at the end. I said, starting the rather long walk to them. As we walked, I pointed out each stone coffin that had a person carved into the top, telling Edward about them, and who they were. I planned, with your consent of course, to have the Greys who died in America be brought here to be laid to rest. From your mother onward with their wives or husbands. I said, turning slightly to see Edward's reaction, which didn't disappoint. His head snapped to look at me. Really? He asked loudly, his voice reverberating off the stone walls of the crypt. I nodded. If we never would have lost track of them, then they would all already be here, but we did. I said, giving Edward a sad smile. I had the crypt expanded for more to be added. So we have more than enough room down here. I said as we finally reached the tombs of Oliver, Gerard, and their wives. Pointing at Oliver's tomb, I explained. He is your great, however many, grandfather, Oliver, I said, then moving my finger to his wife. And she is your grandmother, Emma. I said, watching as he moved close to the carved stone figures of them. And these two, I said pointing to the other tombs, are your great, how many ever, uncle and auntie. Gerard and Isabel. I said, stepping closer to the tombs myself to get a look at them. I kinda look like him. Edward sighed as he looked down at the carved figure of Oliver. Turning my head slightly, I had to agree as I looked at the carved face then Edward's. You actually do. I said, amazed at just realizing. Of course, they didn't look exactly the same, but you could definitely see the similarities. Attacked. Leaving the chapel, I was telling Edward a story about Oliver when my ears picked up on a strange sound. Coming to a halt, I turned to Edward. Did you hear that? I asked in a whisper. The sound I heard sounded like a stone cracking, or possibly being stepped on. Here wah, Edward began when I heard the sound again. Adam. Edward sighed, turning his head upwards to the top of the stone walls that surrounded the castle. Following his gaze, I saw vampires beginning to blur to a stop along the wall of the castle. That's not good. I said in a curious tone. They found out what happened to the Brando coven, Edward sighed, turning his head to look at the numerous vampires linking the walls. They didn't know we knew about them. But as soon as they figured out what happened to the Brando coven they decided to do a full-out attack before we could. Hopefully catching us off guard. But that clearly didn't work. Edward whispered to me. No kidding. I said in a normal tone. Stepping forward, I stood in front of Edward as I spoke. Which one of you is the leader? I shouted. It wasn't necessary for me to do that, but I was hoping it would be loud enough to get Jane and Julius's attention. None of them moved. Oh, don't be shy now. Show yourself, coward. I shouted again. Coward, you say? A male voice said from my side in a pompous tone. Turning my head, I saw a young man with long golden blonde shoulder-length hair, crouched on the wall, a little smirk on his face. Those are very big words to be coming from a human. He chuckled. Are you the leader? I shouted. He smiled at me. Perhaps. He said with a small smile. No, you're not. I said, turning my head to look at the other vampire. Excuse me. The prick said in an affronted voice. You heard me. You're too good looking to be the leader, I said, continuing my scan of the other vampires as I spoke. Even for vampires, you're good looking. Which means, you're just the front for whoever is really pulling the strings. I said, hoping Edward was reading the minds of the vampires, because I couldn't tell who it was. It's that one. Edward sighed, pointing to a rat-faced vampire. The man was average height with a bit of a gut and dirty-looking curly brown hair. Ah, so you're the leader? I asked, turning to look at the man. I saw he was now sneering at us. Bingo. I said, firing a finger gun at the vampire. This made him raise a brow, but before he had time to realize what was happening, I was standing next to him, prying his head off his shoulders with a simple twist of my hands. As soon as the other vampires realized I had disappeared from where I had been standing, they attacked. But thankfully my shouting must have gotten Julius and Jane's attention, because as soon as the attacking vampires moved, Julius and Jane appeared as blurring figures into the courtyard. Julius came to a stop right in front of Edward's frozen form, lifting his hands as well as 10 vampires from the walls with his mind. Jane also stopped next to Edward, quickly firing her pain ability on multiple vampires in quick succession, causing them to drop to their knees with just the split seconds of her pain ability. All the while I moved through the mass of vampires surrounding me, pulling off heads and limbs with my bare hands, occasionally using my aura to manifest small blades along the outside of my hands to chop through vampires. Sidestepping a swipe from a vampire behind me, I came face to face with the good-looking vampire dude. Hey, it's good to see you. I said loudly with a laugh before I crushed his shocked face between my palms, before returning to the fight with ease as his nearly headless corpse fell to the cobbled stone. I lost myself in the fight, but remembered not to use any shock waves. If I did, there was a good chance I might cause harm to the walls, castle, or the buildings surrounding the castle. The last thing I wanted was to deal with Julius winning about the damages. Turning, I went to swing at one of the last remaining vampires, but he was yanked into the air before I could get to him, to be smashed together with another vampire Julius was holding in the air with the force of 2 trucks colliding. The sound that came from them hitting, it might as well have been 2 trucks. Ignoring that impressive feat, I hurriedly dispatched the last of the still standing vampires. Kicking the body of a dead vampire to the side, I looked over the side of the stone wall to see Julius and Jane turned and talking to Edward. Is everyone still in one piece? I asked in a normal voice. Turning to look at me, Julius gave me a thumbs up, before turning back to talk to Edward. Figuring I would get a start on dealing with the bodies of the vampires, I started to throw them over the side of the wall and into the courtyard. Making sure not to miss any limbs, I leaned over the wall again. Would you by chance have a gas can? I asked Julius, who was now in the process of lifting the bodies of the vampires into a pile with his telekinesis. It's petrol, and yes we do. Julius said. Gas, petrol, it's the same damn thing. I said, dropping over the side of the wall. Yes, but I say it correctly, Julius said with a snicker. It's a liquid, not a gas. He added, lifting more bodies to add to his mounting pile of corpses. Leaving him to get all of the bodies into a pile, I walked over to Jane and Edward who were still talking. Reaching them, Jane turned to look at me. It would seem that was all of the covens, she said, gesturing at Edward. He says he managed to get that from some of the vampires' minds before you and Julius killed them. I smiled at that. Don't you love it when the problem comes to you? I said with a chuckle. She smirked, sure. But normally a problem isn't close to 100 vampires wanting to tear you to bits. She said, leaving to help Julius set fire to the large pile of vampires. Looking at Edward, I raised a brow. How are you feeling? I asked, tuning myself to watch as Julius poured gas on the pile of vampires. I am good, he said, not sounding like he felt what he said. Are you sure about that? I asked. He looked towards the pile of bodies. No, he said simply. Wanna talk about it? I asked. He didn't say anything, and instead watched as Jane lit a match and tossed it onto the pile, causing a large plume of fire to shoot up and engulf the bodies. I held reserves when it came to you being the Adam, he said, turning to glance at me, but, during this fight, I couldn't even follow your motions. You moved so fast and ripped vampires apart like they were made out of tissue paper. I turned to look at him with a raised brow. Where are you going with this? I asked. He shrugged his shoulders, the flicker of the large fire dancing over his face. I honestly don't know, he said with a shake of his head. Maybe now I just had something confirmed that I didn't want to be true. He said. Before we could continue, we all turned our heads in the direction of a banging sound coming from the front gate. Oh, I said, alarmed. It's the police. They got noise complaints about loud sounds of screaming and bangs that sounded like gunshots and explosions. Edward saw-ed, his eyes growing wide. Turning to look at Julius and Jane, I shouted. Not it. Before blurring into the building, leaving Julius to deal with the problem. Back in New York, we ended up staying for another month in England as I made sure we had ended all of the covens involved in this little coup d'etat against Julius and Jane. After going to each of the involved covens' place of residence, I found letters sent between the covens, detailing their harebrained plan, which wasn't very smart. Their plan was to give Julius and Jane the boot, preferably dead. After they, successfully, did that, they were going to send an emissary to the Volturi, telling them that England was now a state of free vampires who could do as they wished. Like I said, not very smart. Other than that, Julius and Jane took Edward across England to show him the country, while I dealt with everything else, my payment for running away when the entire police force showed up outside the castle. It wasn't too bad though, it's not like I haven't seen every crack and crevice this country had to offer. Edward and I took a ship back to America around the end of 1934, on a luxurious cruise liner, celebrating the new year while on board. Docking back in New York, we were picked up by Carlyle. It's good to see you, Carlyle. I said, giving him a quick hug. Yes, it's only been, what, a few months. He chuckled, giving my back a hard pat. That doesn't mean I haven't missed you. I chuckled, picking my suitcase back up. It's good to see you, Carlyle. Edward saw-ed as he and Carlyle hugged. Anything important happen while we were gone? I asked, putting my suitcase in the trunk. Kind of. Carlyle said, fiddling with the keys in his hands, not looking at me. Oh really? I said, glancing at Edward, who looked just as confused. And what, kind of, happened? I asked. Well, we might have a new member of the coven. Carlyle said, dropping a bomb on my head. What? I said loudly, unable to control my tone. Fuck fuck. I thought, mentally freaking out. I had planned on saving her somehow when we returned from England, not thinking she would have been changed so soon. Controlling my reaction, I changed my face to one of happiness, while still freaking out on the inside. That's great news, Carlyle, I'm so happy for you. I said, taking a step closer to give him a pat on the shoulder while I smiled wide. Thanks, Adam. Carlyle said, wincing as I patted his shoulder. What's their name? I asked. Her name is Rosalie. Carlyle said, a small smile showing on his face. Why me, Lord? I cried in my head. Rosalie. Edward murmured under his breath. Getting into Carlyle's Ford, I closed my door, my thoughts wandering as Carlyle started the car. The whole drive back to the apartments, Carlyle continued to talk about Rosalie, as if he was trying to convince us to accept her. Interrupting him, I had to ask. How long ago did you change her? He turned to look at me. About a week ago. So on New Year's night. I found her in an alley. She had been, well, she should be the one to tell you. But it wasn't good, Adam. I nodded my head, remembering something I had written in my personal hidden journal. And what has she been doing recently? Nothing, Carlyle said, turning onto our road. At the moment she's been in our home while she gets herself under control. Carlyle said. I nodded. So she hasn't left to go anywhere? I asked. He shook his head, giving me a concerned look. Why do you ask? Because now she's a vampire and most likely wanting revenge. I said, returning his gaze. His brows creased together. She said she didn't know who attacked her. Carlyle said, glancing between me and the road. Of course she did, I said, opening my door as Carlyle pulled in front of our apartment building. Quickly grabbing our suitcases, we made our way to the top floor. It became instantly apparent that something was off as soon as we walked through the door and saw Esme pacing in front of the hallway to the living room. Oh, thank goodness you're back, she said to Carlyle, giving me and Edward a rushed smile, before she began to speak again. Rosalie is gone. She left through her bedroom window, she said, beginning to pace again. How long ago did you notice she was gone? Carlyle asked. Esme shrugged, maybe 10 minutes after you left. So about an hour ago. Esme said, turning to look at us with worried eyes. It will be almost impossible to find her. Esme said, shaking her head side to side. Carlyle nodded while letting out a sigh. The best we can hope for now is that she returns on her own. He said, a sad look in his eyes. Maybe for all of you. But I think I might be able to track her down. I said, digging in my pocket for a small black notebook. Really? Esme asked excitedly. I nodded my head, flipping through the black notebook, finding the extension for the New York bank. Finding it, I walked to the phone, making a personal call to the bank head. After giving the password, I was sent straight to the bank head, where I got the address of one of their workers. Writing the address of their apartment on a small piece of paper, I folded it and put it in my pocket. Hanging up the phone, I turned to see everyone looking at me. Who's this Mr. King? Carlyle asked. Someone I suspect is her target. What? Carlyle and Esme asked in unison, confused as to how I could already have a suspect in mind, while Edward stood there with a bored-looking expression. It's a long story. I'll explain when I get back. I said, starting for the door. I'll come with you. Carlyle said, starting after me. Coming to an abrupt halt, I turned to face him. It will be best if you wait here. I said, giving him a showing motion with my hands. But, Carlyle started before I cut him off. Carlyle, let me do my magic. I said, giving him a stern look as I kept my voice level. He stared at me for a moment, before nodding his head in agreement. Very well, he said, taking a step backwards. Thank you, I said, turning and heading for the door again. Nighttime adventures. Standing on a ledge of the 45th floor of a high-rise apartment building, I crouched down as I looked through the window at a familiar young man, who was currently trying to drown himself with alcohol as tears ran down his face. No matter how much you drink, she's still coming for you. I thought with an evil smile as I waited for the inevitable moment when Rose showed up. And just like I knew, she did come for him. The sounds of gunshots and screams cut through the air like a knife, as Rose killed her way to King Jr. I watched as he started to cry and backed himself into a corner as the inevitable began to happen. The screams and gunshots stopped nearly as quickly as they began, leaving a deafening silence, before the door exploded and the wedding dress-clad Rosalie marched her way in. She stopped just inside the door to give her prey a wicked smile, before she pounced and ripped King apart. As she did that, I managed to open the window, allowing me to sneak inside, while she did her business. Stepping onto the carpeted floor, I quietly closed the window behind me, as I quietly walked over to the large plush chair in the corner of the room. Sitting down, I watched as Rosalie ripped off a leg then an arm, beating the man with his own appendages. Only when there was nothing but mush left of him, Rosalie finally stopped, her head back as she let out an audible sigh. Feeling better? I asked, reaching into my pocket for the gold cigarette case. Not that I needed a smoke, but to give my hands something to do. In a blur, Rosalie twisted around, her teeth bared in a snarl. Relax, would ya? I said, placing a cigarette between my lips as I flicked the lid of my lighter, lighting the cigarette. Who are you? She snarled, bracing herself to attack me. I put a hand up to placate her, while I lit the cigarette before beginning. I'm Adam. I'm sure Carlyle has told you who I am. I said, taking a pull off my cigarette. Rosalie arched a brow as she stared at me, her demeanor not shifting. Which was okay, because it gave me time to look her over. She had certainly changed since the last time I had seen her in the bank all those months ago. Yes, she still looked the same, but there was also something very different about her. Her skin looked smoother, her hair more vibrant, and her eyes more piercing. Rosalie grimaced, her back seeming to straighten just a tad as she looked me over. Then one of her eyebrows seemed to twitch. I've seen you before, she said, her eyes slightly drifting as she recalled the memory. From the bank, she said, refocusing her blood-red eyes back on me. I nodded my head. Yes, that was me. I said, tapping the ash from my cigarette onto the carpet. Quite the coincidence, don't you think? I asked with a smirk. She sneered again, before I turned to look at the doorway. It seems it is time for our grand escape, I said, standing up. What? Rosalie asked as she looked between the door and me. More police are on their way up the elevator now. They just got on at the ground floor, I said, walking over to the curtains. She looked at me with a raised brow. You must be joking, she said, looking down the hall through the broken door of the room at the solitary elevator at the end of the hall. No, I'm not, I said, pulling my lighter out of my pocket. Now, if you wouldn't mind, could you open that window there so we can leave while I cover your tracks? I asked as I lit the curtains on fire, then the bed and other flammable things. Waiting until I was sure the room was well and surely on fire, I showed Rosalie out of the room. Just as she was stepping onto the ledge of the window, we both turned our heads at the sound of the elevator opening down the hallway. Huh, I heard Rosalie say under her breath as I stepped onto the ledge beside her. What now? Rosalie asked as we looked down at the brightly lit city below us. We jump, I said, taking a final drag off of my cigarette before flicking it away. Jump? Rosalie asked, alarmed. Yeah, jump, I said, turning to look at her with a smirk. Can we even do that? She asked, alarmed. I can, yes. But normally for vampires like yourself, no. At the moment you are much stronger than a regular vampire and can do some pretty incredible things like this, I said as the heat from the burning room behind us grew. She looked down at the ground far below us, then back at me. Scared of heights? I asked with a playful grin. Yes, she said as the sound of cracking timber came from behind us. Well, take your time. We have a few more minutes before the fire causes the room behind us to collapse, I said, leaning on the brick wall of the window's recess. I couldn't help but chuckle silently as I thought about our current predicament. Rosalie shifted from foot to foot as she gained her courage in a white wedding dress on the 45th floor of a luxurious apartment building with a fire burning behind us. As she stood there, I listened to the timbers and bricks beginning to collapse behind us. Time's up, I said, quickly grabbing hold of Rosalie's arm before leaning backwards. Rosalie let out an ear-piercing scream as we dropped, her nails digging into my arms as I positioned myself so I was on the bottom. Looking down, I saw she had her eyes shut while she dug her head into my chest. You're missing the best part, I said with a loud laugh as I watched the ledge we had just been standing on collapse. Turning our bodies, I lifted Rosalie slightly so when we landed, it would be my feet hitting the ground instead of both of ours at the same time. Which is what happened. My feet slammed into the ground, cracking the concrete ground under me 3 feet in all directions, my $200 shoes exploding with the force of my landing. I stood there for a moment as the sound of sirens got closer, and people began to line the streets to watch the burning building. Looking at the faces, I looked to see if we had been spotted, which we hadn't. Everyone's attention was on the burning building. Good, I said, looking back down at Rosalie, who I was still holding off the ground. Her head was still buried in my chest, as well as her nails in my forearms. You can let go now, I said, softly setting her down on the ground. Her head popped up as she looked around, her eyes wide in surprise and astonishment as she looked up at where we had been standing. We did it, you did it, she said, turning her head to stare at me in awe. I gave her a smirk. Well, yeah, I said with a chuckle, I don't know about you, but I would like to avoid getting crushed by a collapsing ceiling, I said as she finally released her nails from my skin. As she released her nails, I saw there were small splotches of my blood on my white dress shirt where her nails had sunk into my flesh. I saw when the smell hit her, her nostrils flared as she sniffed the air. I wouldn't do that if I was you, I said, clasping my arms behind me, my blood is toxic to vampires. I said, giving her a sheepish grin. I wasn't, she said with an angry frown as she turned to look at the large bunches of people that had begun to appear on the sidewalk to watch the fire. We should get going, I said, taking a step away from Rosalie. Yeah, she said, turning to follow me. We should stop to get you some new clothes, yours are all bloody, I said, before looking down at my now bare feet. And me some new shoes, I said with a chuckle as I started to walk towards where I knew a dress and men's wear store was close by. As I walked, Rosalie picked up her pace to walk beside me. How did you know where I was? Rosalie asked, her eyes staring at the side of my head like lasers. I had a suspicion, I said, looking over at her. A suspicion? She asked. Yeah, I remembered seeing you talk to that King guy at the bank. So I swung by his apartment to see if you went there, and as it turned out, you had. I said, sidestepping a group of people who were walking down the sidewalk to get a look at the burning building. How did you know he lived there? She asked. A simple call, I said, all of my employees' addresses are on file so all I had to do was call. Rosalie thought for a moment before it dawned on her. Wait, but he worked at Gringotts, she said looking back up at me. I looked down at her with a raised brow and a small smile. I own Gringotts, I said, smiling as I watched her face go through a dozen emotions of shock. But, she stammered. We reached the shop a few minutes later where I bought a cheap pair of shoes and a few articles of clothes for Rosalie, who was waiting in an alley not far away. Handing the bag over, I turned away from her as she began to remove the blood-soaked dress. I heard the ruffle of the bag before a scoff. This looks like clothes my mother wears, she said, before putting the clothes on. You can get rid of them when we get home. They are just so we can get home without the cops being called because you are wearing a dress covered in blood, I said, reaching for my cigarette case again while I waited for Rosalie to finish dressing. Once she was done getting dressed, we took a cab home. Giving the driver a few bills and a tip, we stepped out of the cab. Do you think Carlisle will be mad? Rosalie asked in a whisper as we stood on the curb in front of the building. Looking down at her, I grinned. No, he won't be angry, I said, giving her a comforting smile. Carlisle has something most others don't: understanding and patience. He knows what it's like to be caught up in the throes of emotions and to want revenge. He will see this as a step in your journey, I said. Rosalie frowned, and looked down at her hands which still had dried blood on them. She looked at them for a few seconds before she balled her hands into fists. Let's go, she said, before she started to walk towards the doors of the apartment building. Rosalie wasn't raped. Yes, something happened with Royce which caused her death, but it will be explained in a later chapter.